Over time, some stores changed seating rules, proving that direct economic disruption could break racist business practices. The sit-ins also attracted the interest and support of other minority groups, white allies, Northerners, and clergy who recognized the courage of these students. The sit-ins laid the foundation for major organizational breakthroughs. They led to the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a group formed in April 1960 in Raleigh, North Carolina. SNCC became one of the most influential organizations in the civil rights movement. Unlike groups controlled by older leaders, SNCC functioned democratically and encouraged collective leadership. Members debated openly, voted regularly, and developed strategies through shared power. This new structure was incredibly attractive to young activists who wanted voices equal to older figures. Under SNCC's leadership, young people launched voter registration drives, organized freedom rides, and challenged segregated institutions across the South. Their work became an engine of grassroots activism, shaping a new era of civil rights efforts. The sit-in movement signaled a major cultural awakening. It showed African Americans and their allies that a new generation had inherited the dream of equality and was prepared to expand its meaning. The power of student activism reshaped public consciousness, empowered communities, and proved that the civil rights movement was not just about survival. It was about redefining what America could become. The founding of SNCC marked an evolution in civil rights strategy. Unlike groups that focus primarily on legal battles or religious guidance, SNCC emphasized direct community involvement, long-term organizing, and the empowerment of those most affected by racism. Many SNCC members moved into dangerous rural counties in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, where local black communities faced overwhelming oppression. These regions, deeply rooted in racial violence, lacked national attention because television cameras rarely filmed there. SNCC workers lived with local families, building trust and encouraging them to take control of their own political futures. They helped African Americans challenge voter suppression, which had erased black political participation for nearly a century. Voter suppression tactics were complex and cruel. White officials used literacy tests filled with confusing questions, impossibly timed applications, or subjective grading methods that ensured nearly all black applicants failed. In some towns, only a handful of black voters remained registered, even in counties where African Americans represented the majority. SNCC activists understood the dangers of confronting such systems. Local sheriffs, white citizens' councils, and the Ku Klux Klan commonly attacked organizers. Homes were burned, churches were bombed, and volunteers were beaten or shot at. Many SNCC workers were arrested dozens of times. Yet despite these threats, they continued their mission, believing that true democracy required representation. The right to vote was not just political, it symbolized humanity. SNCC also challenged not only segregation laws, but the psychological damage of racism. Many elders in Southern communities had lived so long under terror that they doubted change was possible. SNCC volunteers encouraged them to believe in their own strength. They taught young people to speak publicly, to challenge authority, and to organize meetings. They helped individuals register for elections, run for local offices, and demand equal wages. This grassroots structure strengthened the movement by decentralizing leadership. It was no longer necessary for change to begin from national figures. Transformation could start with a sharecropper, a teacher, or a teenage student willing to walk into a courthouse. While SNCC worked quietly within rural communities, another major force of activism emerged: the Freedom Rides. In 1961, interracial groups of activists boarded buses to challenge segregated travel facilities. Although the Supreme Court had ruled that interstate buses and bus terminals must be integrated, many southern states ignored the law. Riders traveled through the South expecting violent responses, and indeed violence erupted almost immediately. In Alabama, a mob firebombed a bus, attempting to burn the riders alive. Others were beaten with clubs, chains, and pipes. Newspapers captured horrifying images of white men attacking passengers who refused to fight back. This brutality shocked the country and pressured the federal government to enforce its own laws. The freedom rides demonstrated two critical truths. First, segregation depended on violence for survival. Second, nonviolent resistance exposed that violence to the world. SNCC members, deeply committed to activism, continued the rides even when national organizations hesitated. Their courage elevated student involvement to heroic stature. Though still young, many riders showed maturity, discipline, and sacrifice that exceeded their years. Their strategy was not simply to disrupt injustice. It was to show Americans the truth that many wanted to ignore. The Freedom Rides, combined with SNCC's on-the-ground organizing, reshaped the civil rights movement into a more fearless, expansive force, one capable of stepping directly into danger to transform the country. Youth participation did more than add energy to the civil rights movement. It changed its direction and meaning. Students brought new cultural identities and questioned assumptions even inside the movement. They introduced music, fashion, slang, and attitudes tied to the rising youth culture of the 1960s. Jazz, blues, and later soul music became symbols of unity and purpose. Protesters sang freedom songs such as "We Shall Overcome," blending hope with resistance. These songs echoed through churches, jails, and streets, becoming emotional armor for activists facing brutality. Music transformed demonstrations into spiritual rituals that strengthened both courage and community. Meanwhile, SNCC's decentralized leadership structure shaped internal debates about the future of the movement. Some members felt that national organizations too often dictated strategy without recognizing local needs. They argued that people living in oppressed counties knew what liberation required more clearly than distant leaders. This approach produced innovation. For example, SNCC encouraged teenagers to speak to newspapers, form youth councils, and lead community discussions. It helped women achieve leadership roles beyond traditional expectations. In many Mississippi communities, women directed voter registration drives, organized safe houses, and negotiated with federal agents. SNCC reshaped ideas about gender roles, just as it reshaped ideas about race and democracy. However, tension formed between generations and philosophies. Martin Luther King Jr. admired the enthusiasm and bravery of student activists, but he sometimes worried that SNCC's confrontational strategies could threaten coalitions. SNCC members respected King, but feared the SCLC sometimes moved too cautiously. Malcolm X, meanwhile, inspired some younger activists to question nonviolence as the only solution. Underneath the movement's united public appearance were passionate debates about how society could be rebuilt. These disagreements did not weaken the movement, they broadened it. Diversity of strategy made the civil rights movement more adaptive, unpredictable, and resilient. SNCC activists also confronted poverty, police surveillance, and emotional exhaustion. Because they worked in rural areas for long periods, far from media support, many experienced trauma that went unrecognized. They witnessed families terrorized by night riders, saw friends murdered, and endured endless legal harassment. Many locals who hosted activists risked everything. In some towns, simply providing lunch to a SNCC worker could result in losing a job or facing threats. Nevertheless, SNCC workers learned to trust community wisdom. They listened more than they commanded, allowing movements to grow naturally instead of forcing change from outside. By the early 1960s, student activists had created a new political language that resonated deeply across the country. They showed that freedom required action rather than permission. Their dedication persuaded liberal Americans to support civil rights legislation and pushed moderate politicians to rethink racial policies. They also influenced other movements, Latino farm workers, indigenous rights groups, and the growing feminist movement studied SNCC tactics, adopting forms of civil disobedience and grassroots organizing. Youth activism did not simply join the civil rights movement. it redefined it. Students proved that courage could be learned, and leadership did not require age or privilege. Each sit-in, each jail sentence, each freedom ride carved new pathways toward equality. These efforts built momentum leading into pivotal battles yet to come. Birmingham, the March on Washington, and the Civil Rights Act. With the nation waking up to injustice, and with young voices shaping the future, America approached a turning point that would force the country to confront its conscience once again. By 1963, the civil rights movement had reached a moment of profound pressure and frustration. Many victories had been symbolic rather than structural, and Black Americans continued facing widespread segregation, low employment opportunities, brutal policing, and political exclusion. To break through stagnation, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, targeted Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Birmingham had earned the grim nickname Bombingham due to frequent attacks on Black homes and churches. White supremacist organizations operated openly, and the city's government, led by Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, proudly embraced racial hatred. Connor believed violence against African Americans was justified, and he intended to crush any challenge to segregation. Yet this environment made Birmingham the perfect location for dramatic confrontation. If the movement could win there, it could win anywhere. Planning the campaign was an immense task. SCLC strategists knew they needed overwhelming participation to shake the city's structure, and they focused on boycotts, marches, and sit-ins. Their goal was to shut down the downtown business district, forcing negotiations. Organizers trained volunteers in nonviolent resistance, preparing them for insults, beatings, and arrest. Workshops taught activists how to remain peaceful even when attacked. They practiced falling to the ground if struck, resisting the urge to fight back, and maintaining consistent posture so the press would witness victims rather than aggressors. These sessions were emotionally difficult, especially for young people confronting the terror that awaited them. When demonstrations began in April 1963, hundreds of protesters were arrested, including King. While in jail, King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, responding to white clergy who accused him of moving too fast. King argued that African Americans had waited more than 300 years for freedom and could not postpone justice. He wrote that justice too long delayed is justice denied, and described the humiliations Black children endured daily. His letter became a timeless philosophical defense of direct action, reminding Americans that moderation disguised as peace could be more dangerous than open hatred. Meanwhile, Birmingham authorities escalated violence. Police used clubs, dogs, and massive surveillance to undermine the movement. Local businesses lost customers, increasing pressure on city leaders. Newspapers covered police attacks, broadcasting shocking images nationwide. American viewers, including many who had previously avoided thinking about racism, watched scenes of peaceful protesters beaten in the streets. This coverage transformed national awareness. The Birmingham campaign showed that civil rights activism was not simply political. It was a desperate human struggle against institutional cruelty. The events in Birmingham soon intensified, expanding into something even more shocking. A new wave of activists, energized by belief and frustration, prepared to take the movement further than anyone imagined. This escalation would change history. One of the most defining chapters of the Birmingham movement was the involvement of children and teenagers in what became known as the Children's Crusade. By May 1963, adult volunteers had been exhausted by mass arrests. Many feared losing jobs or homes, and the city's economy struggled. Yet momentum needed to continue. Activists realized that young people, particularly high school and middle school students, were eager to join the movement. They had already experienced humiliations of segregation in classrooms, libraries, movie theaters, and playgrounds. Though controversial, SCLC organizer James Bevel proposed recruiting youth to fill jails and overwhelm the system. King supported the idea after long consideration, seeing it as a necessary step to break Birmingham's resistance. When the Children's Crusade began, hundreds of students left school to march downtown. They were met with unimaginable hostility. Bull Connor, enraged by the sight of black children demanding freedom, ordered police to unleash attack dogs and fire hoses. Television cameras captured teenagers slammed to the pavement by high-pressure water powerful enough to tear bark off trees. Dogs lunged at screaming children. Police dragged young girls by their hair and hurled boys into police wagons. Some children were as young as 6 or 7 years old. Instead of frightening the nation into silence, these images enraged people across the country. Americans who had never joined the civil rights conversation were moved to tears, anger, and shame. Newspapers printed disturbing photographs on front pages. Television anchors described the scenes with disbelief. The moral contrast was overwhelming. Peaceful children, singing songs of hope, faced government-sanctioned brutality. Demonstrations grew daily as hundreds, then thousands, of young people marched, were arrested, and returned the next morning to march again. Birmingham's jails overflowed, turning schools, vans, and makeshift rooms into detention centers. Connor's plan to crush the movement backfired. Instead of intimidating activists, he exposed the viciousness of segregation. Historians later argued that the Children's Crusade was perhaps the most influential public relations victory in the entire civil rights movement. The world saw the United States claim leadership in democracy while beating its own children over skin color. The contradiction was too enormous to ignore. Federal officials, including President John F. Kennedy, were forced to respond. Kennedy initially preferred gradual reform, but Birmingham's horror demanded urgent attention. Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive with depth, emotion, and truth. Today, we begin one of the most powerful journeys in American history, the story of the civil rights movement. This is not just a timeline of events. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, revolution, heartbreak, hope, and transformation. From the Montgomery bus boycott to the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., from the fearless stand of Rosa Parks to the electrifying voice of Malcolm X, from sit-ins and marches to violent backlash, assassinations, legal victories, and cultural rebirth, this story reshaped the United States forever. You'll hear about the people who stood undefeated against racism, segregation, and hatred. You will witness how millions fought for dignity and equality, building activism that continues today in streets, classrooms, voting booths, and digital networks. You will understand how the movement grew into 50-plus years of struggle, touching law, politics, schools, prisons, police culture, the arts, economics, and voting rights. If you love history, drama, revolution, and truth, this is the story you cannot miss. Because once you start hearing what happened, once you learn what people faced and survived, you will not want to pause. This is the story that shaped modern America. This is the story that still shapes us today. Welcome to the Civil Rights Movement. Let the journey begin. The American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s did not suddenly appear out of nowhere. Rather, it was the result of centuries of struggle, trauma, belief, and determination that African Americans carried since the earliest years of slavery in the United States. Before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, before Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed publicly of equality, and before Malcolm X thundered against oppression, African Americans had survived nearly 300 years of forced labor, racial terror, segregation, and political exclusion. The civil rights movement represents the continuation of a long fight, stretching back to the abolitionist movement of the 1800s, the failed promises of Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow laws that institutionalized segregation throughout the South. In the early 20th century, African Americans migrated from the rural South to northern and western cities in what is known as the Great Migration. Millions left behind cotton fields, lynching threats, and legal discrimination to pursue factory work, education, and dignity. This migration significantly changed American culture, politics, and demographics. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles gained new black communities, which helped develop strong artistic scenes such as the Harlem Renaissance. Newspapers, churches, community organizations, and newly formed civil rights groups began shaping black political identity. These forces helped set the stage for the modern civil rights movement by creating spaces where ideas could be exchanged and by encouraging unity among African Americans. Meanwhile, the legal system continued enforcing racial separation. After the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision declared separate but equal constitutional, segregation spread into every area of life. Schools, buses, hospitals, restaurants, transportation, and drinking fountains. African Americans were arrested or beaten for resisting these laws, and in many cases, they were simply killed without consequence. Jim Crow was not just a set of laws. It was a culture of violence and humiliation meant to remind black Americans that white supremacy controlled their existence. Churches burned, homes were invaded, and people vanished at night. Lynchings became public events, sometimes advertised in newspapers, reminding the black population that racial equality was forbidden territory. By 1950, this system was deeply rooted, but beneath the surface, resistance was growing. Veterans returning from World War II asked how the United States could preach democracy abroad while denying basic human rights at home. These soldiers, many of whom had fought fascism overseas, began to organize, vote, and demand change. The movement that was about to shake the world was slowly forming, built on the courage and endurance of generations who refused to surrender to injustice. The mid-20th century civil rights movement emerged from a powerful combination of social forces, leaders, events, and ideologies that fused into something unstoppable. Churches played a crucial role, serving not only as spiritual centers, but as safe gathering places for political planning. Ministers were often the most educated members of their communities, and their voices reached hundreds of people every week. This made churches natural engines of resistance. The movement also benefited from organizations such as the NAACP, founded in 1909, which used the court system to challenge segregation. One of the most important victories the NAACP achieved came in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. This decision destroyed the separate but equal myth and signaled the beginning of legal dismantling of Jim Crow. His administration worked behind the scenes to pressure local leaders to negotiate. Eventually, Birmingham business owners and city officials agreed to begin desegregating public facilities, improving hiring practices, and releasing jail protesters. Although racist violence did not end immediately, the agreements represented real progress. The Birmingham campaign proved that televised brutality could force political change and public empathy. It showed that activism rooted in nonviolence could reshape narratives and expose injustice to the world. However, victory came with emotional scars. Many children experienced trauma that never fully healed. Their courage highlighted the extreme cruelty African Americans endured daily. Yet their bravery reshaped moral understanding. The Children's Crusade opened doors for legislative progress, shifting national opinion closer to civil rights reform. Birmingham had positioned the movement for its greatest legislative breakthrough, the Civil Rights Act. The aftermath of the Birmingham campaign was filled with both triumph and heartbreak. Although negotiations secured desegregation commitments and economic improvements, racist retaliation continued. On September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church, one of Birmingham's key organizing centers, was bombed by white supremacists. The explosion killed 4 African American girls: Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. Their deaths shook the nation. Images of charred in books and shattered stained glass windows spread across newspapers, revealing that victory over segregation did not mean safety. The bombing demonstrated the rage of white supremacists who felt the ground shifting beneath them. Rather than silencing the movement, The tragedy strengthened public support for civil rights legislation. However, progress was not welcomed by everyone. Many southern states aggressively resisted desegregation. Some governors defied federal law. State legislatures passed new segregation rules, and white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan increased terrorism. African American children attempting to enter previously all-white schools faced mobs screaming racial slurs, throwing stones, and threatening violence. The Little Rock Nine crisis in 1957, where 9 black students attempted to integrate Central High School in Arkansas, forced the U.S. Army to intervene. This confrontation revealed that America was deeply divided not only by law, but by attitudes, fears, and hatred that had been embedded into white society for generations. While legal battles occurred, another form of resistance gained momentum: mass nonviolent protest. Inspired by Christian teachings and by the success of Mahatma Gandhi in India, black leaders began shaping a strategy that used peaceful marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and demonstrations to highlight injustice. The idea was simple but revolutionary: force America to confront its own hypocrisy by refusing to return violence with violence. When television cameras captured peaceful protesters being attacked by police, the world saw the truth. This helped shift public opinion, especially in northern states, and pressured politicians to support federal action against segregation. An important moment came in 1955, when a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young, relatively unknown pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. Thousands of African Americans refused to use city buses for over a year, walking to work or arranging carpools. This movement proved that economic pressure could create real change, and it also launched King into national leadership. His powerful speaking ability, moral conviction, and faith in nonviolence captured America's attention. The success of the boycott gave black Americans new hope and proved that organized, peaceful resistance could challenge the foundations of segregation. The civil rights movement was no longer local or invisible. It had become a national force, ready to change history forever. Even though the civil rights movement made important gains during the 1950s, African Americans continued facing extreme economic inequality and violence. In many communities, black families lived in overcrowded neighborhoods with limited access to education, medical care, and employment opportunities. Banks denied loans based on race, schools remained legally or unofficially segregated, and job discrimination forced many black people into low-paying work, regardless of their skills or education. These injustices fueled anger and frustration, especially among younger African Americans who believed progress was moving far too slowly. At the same time, grassroots organizers traveled across the South, encouraging voter registration drives, fighting legal barriers that prevented black participation in democracy. Many activists risked their lives simply by encouraging people to vote. Southern officials responded with literacy tests, poll taxes, and arrest threats. Some county registrars removed black citizens' names from voting rolls without explanation. Behind each law was the determination to keep white political control intact. By the late 1950s, television coverage began influencing national awareness of racial injustice. Images of segregated bus stations, separated drinking fountains, and racially restricted waiting rooms shocked viewers who were not familiar with everyday Southern life. For some Americans, it was the first time they realized how deeply racism was woven into the country's social fabric. The civil rights movement began winning sympathy across state lines, and more young people joined the struggle. College students formed new groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, dedicated to direct action. They staged sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until served. These protests spread across the country, forcing businesses to reconsider their policies. Peaceful protesters were dragged away, beaten, or thrown in jail, but the movement only grew stronger. Meanwhile, Malcolm X rose to prominence in the Nation of Islam, preaching that African Americans should reject white approval resist oppression, and find pride in black identity. His message contrasted sharply with King's nonviolent philosophy, but Malcolm X spoke to young people who felt unheard. His ideas of cultural strength, self-defense, and dignity reshaped black consciousness and helped birth later movements such as Black Power. The civil rights movement was not a single voice. It was a chorus of many strategies, hopes, frustrations, and dreams. Each leader offered a different vision for liberation, and this diversity of ideas expanded the meaning of freedom. As the 1960s approached, the United States stood on the edge of political transformation. The pressure of protests, the spread of new ideas, and the increasing involvement of young people created a feeling that change was no longer distant. It was coming soon. Activists, churches, students, writers, and community leaders prepared for the next wave of struggle. The civil rights movement was becoming more organized, more visible, and more determined than ever. There was no turning back. The story was only beginning. The Montgomery bus boycott, beginning in December 1955, marked a turning point in the civil rights movement and changed America's social landscape forever. While Rosa Parks is widely remembered for refusing to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger, the story did not emerge out of isolated coincidence. Her act of defiance came from decades of frustration and active resistance that black women were already leading within Montgomery. Parks had been a longtime member of the NAACP, working as a secretary, investigator, and organizer. She had documented cases of sexual violence against African American women and had grown increasingly impatient with the silent acceptance expected from black citizens. Her refusal to stand was a conscious act of political resistance rather than physical exhaustion from work, as was sometimes wrongly reported. She made a calm, powerful statement. She would no longer accept humiliation as normal life. When Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, the black community responded with remarkable unity. Activists quickly printed thousands of leaflets calling for a bus boycott, and within days, organizers created the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, selecting a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. as president. King was only 26 years old and had been in Montgomery for just over a year, but his eloquence, education, and calm authority convinced people he could lead. Churches mobilized entire neighborhoods. Thousands of workers who depended on bus transportation refused to ride. Some walked for miles to their workplaces, turning their daily commute into a quiet form of protest. Others drove carpools, working around police harassment and legal threats. The boycott lasted for 381 days, far longer than anyone imagined. During this period, African Americans suffered harsh retaliation. Many lost jobs, were threatened at gunpoint, or faced violent intimidation. King's home was bombed, and new laws attempted to criminalize boycott participation. Still, the community refused to quit. Churches stayed packed every night with meetings, speeches, and prayer services. Women, who made up the vast majority of Montgomery bus riders, were the backbone of the boycott effort. They endured rain, exhaustion, dusty roads, and long distances, yet remained committed because they believed their children deserved a better future. Eventually, the legal system responded. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were unconstitutional, forcing Montgomery to desegregate its public transit system. The victory created a shockwave across the South. It showed that well-organized, disciplined, nonviolent protest could break the foundations of Jim Crow. King became a national figure almost overnight, and the boycott became a model for future protests. The movement had discovered something priceless. Collective action held the power to rewrite law, culture, and identity. The Montgomery bus boycott was not simply a protest about seating arrangements. It was a declaration that African Americans would no longer accept second-class citizenship. The boycott proved that ordinary people, united by purpose, could confront a system designed to crush them. It lit a flame that would burn throughout the 1960s and beyond, reshaping the American dream itself. After Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr.'s role expanded beyond the boundaries of one city. His leadership style brought moral credibility to the civil rights movement, inspiring national attention and encouraging supporters across divisions of race, religion, and class. King believed deeply in the philosophy of nonviolence, influenced by the teachings of Jesus, the writings of Henry David Thoreau, and the actions of Mahatma Gandhi. Rather than accepting violence as the only method to confront oppression, King argued that loving one's enemy could transform society. Critics mocked the idea, calling it impossible and naive, yet King believed violence created endless cycles of revenge and suffering. Nonviolence demanded courage, discipline, and dignity, allowing protesters to maintain the moral high ground even when facing brutality. To build momentum, King and other leaders founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957. The organization aimed to unite black churches into a powerful network capable of coordinating protests across the South. The SCLC helped train new leaders, strategize campaigns, and secure funding for marches. Church basements turned into planning rooms. Worship centers became headquarters of political activism. The SCLC believed that moral appeal could awaken the conscience of white Americans. They hoped the nation would see African Americans not as economic threats or political opponents, but as citizens demanding their constitutional rights. Meanwhile, segregationists hardened their resistance. White citizens' councils formed throughout the South to boycott black businesses, fire black workers, destroy reputations, and intimidate activists. Schools resisted desegregation orders with delays, legal tricks, and threats. Police departments strengthened their forces, preparing to crush demonstrations. Confederate symbols, nearly forgotten after the Civil War, suddenly returned, placed on state flags and public buildings to signal racial defiance. Many Southern politicians declared that God himself supported segregation, twisting religious teachings into tools of oppression. Southern newspapers often portrayed King as dangerous, claiming he threatened traditional Southern life, even though his movement remained peaceful. Yet King continued traveling, writing, and speaking, spreading a message that equality was not just a political issue, but a moral and spiritual one. His speeches described segregation as a wound poisoning the soul of America. He argued that democracy could not survive while millions were denied basic dignity. King traveled thousands of miles each year, meeting with local activists, delivering sermons, and strengthening the movement's emotional unity. His ability to mix poetry, history, and faith into every speech created a language that ordinary people could believe in. For many African Americans living under constant fear, King's voice became a source of strength. At the same time, not all African American leaders agreed with his methods. Malcolm X criticized King for asking oppressed people to love their oppressors, arguing that self-defense and pride were necessary to achieve respect. Some younger activists believed progress required confrontation, not patience. But despite ideological disagreements, King continued pushing forward with his mission to awaken the country, to change unjust laws, and to create a nation where future generations would not inherit racial hatred. King's rise shaped the movement's identity, turning it into a national struggle rather than a regional conflict. America was heading toward a storm of change. The civil rights movement of the late 1950s became a national conversation, not simply because of great leaders, but because thousands of ordinary people committed themselves to altering daily patterns of injustice. In many southern cities, African Americans lived in constant fear. Police departments enforced racial order with brutality. Economic structures kept wages low and opportunities limited, and social norms prevented interracial contact. When black individuals questioned these systems, they risked losing their homes, jobs, and safety. Yet this very climate of fear ignited strength beneath the surface. African American families taught children to navigate racism while still believing in future change. Parents told stories of hope even while living in segregation, weaving a culture of endurance. During this period, the media began reshaping public perception. Television sets had entered millions of American homes, and nightly news broadcasts transported images of racial conflict directly to the living rooms of people who had never traveled south. Viewers who previously assumed racial harmony existed in the United States suddenly faced shocking scenes of injustice. White policemen arrested black teenagers for sitting at lunch counters, screaming mobs protested school integration, and firebombed homes were filmed smoldering in the night. For many Americans outside the South, this was their first exposure to the severity of racial segregation. Although Northern racism existed in housing, hiring, and policing, the South appeared to many viewers as something brutal and extreme. This shift helped the civil rights movement gain allies, money, volunteers, and political sympathy. The movement also exposed deep contradictions within the American identity. The United States presented itself globally as a symbol of liberty, especially during the Cold War, arguing that democracy offered freedom, equality, and opportunity. Yet African Americans could not drink from the same water fountains, attend the same schools, or vote freely. Enemy nations used these contradictions to criticize American hypocrisy. Leaders in Washington realized that segregation weakened international credibility, especially among African and Asian nations emerging from colonial rule. The pressure to reform grew not just morally, but politically and strategically. Inside black communities, activism expanded beyond speeches and court cases. Local leaders organized voter registration drives despite harassment. Women formed financial committees, feeding protesters and raising bail money. Teachers risked termination to encourage students to march. College students trained to endure verbal abuse during sit-ins, practicing how to remain peaceful under attack. These behind-the-scenes efforts made demonstrations possible. When viewers saw protesters marching calmly, they did not see the months of planning, the exhaustion, or the danger activists faced every day. The movement was not spontaneous. It required endless labor and courage. By 1960, the nation stood on the threshold of dramatic transformation. Segregationists were preparing for violent resistance, and nonviolent activists prepared to push harder. Young people, energized with new purpose, believed the future could be radically different from the past. Every courtroom victory, every speech, every boycott, and every march made the future more visible. King, Parks, and MalcolmX represented icons, but the true body of the movement was the millions who risked everything, believing that justice was not a distant dream, but a right they could claim. The next decade would either redeem American democracy or expose its false promises. The stage was set for confrontation on a scale the nation had never witnessed. The early 1960s witnessed a dramatic shift in the civil rights movement as young African Americans, many of them college students, stepped forward with determination and fresh strategy. This generational involvement played a transformative role that expanded the movement beyond church leadership and courtroom challenges. Youth activism demonstrated that the struggle was not only fueled by past suffering, but also grounded in future dreams. Most famously, the student sit-in movement began on February 1st, 1960, when 4 African-American students from North Carolina A&T walked into a Woolworth retail store in Greensboro and sat down at a segregated lunch counter. Although they were refused service, they remained seated with calm persistence. Their simple act inspired a revolutionary pattern. The next day, more students joined them, and soon the demonstration spread across states. Thousands of young people participated in sit-ins, occupying public spaces that had always excluded them. These students faced jeers, thrown food, beatings, and arrests. Yet their actions altered the psychology of the movement. Before sit-ins became popular, the civil rights movement was often seen as a leadership-driven effort centered around pastors, lawyers, and older community figures. The sit-ins shifted this perception by revealing the power of ordinary young individuals who were willing to sacrifice comfort and safety for social justice. Many students had grown up watching the contradictions of their country. On one hand, they memorized the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in school. On the other hand, Anti-black prejudice shaped their daily experiences. They were denied equal education, faced segregation in restaurants and theaters, and were taught to accept submissive roles in social interaction. The sit-ins symbolized the rejection of social obedience. They announced that young black Americans had the right to exist with dignity, to speak loudly, and to demand change. Another remarkable development was the rapid spread of media coverage. Newspapers and television stations filmed the sit-ins, broadcasting live images of well-dressed students sitting quietly while white crowds hurled insults at them. This contrast shaped national opinion because it revealed who the aggressors truly were. Business owners initially responded through violence and arrests, but as protests disrupted commerce, they eventually felt financial pressure. Restaurants lost money daily, forcing companies to rethink their segregationist policies. Martin Luther King Jr. visited Watts shortly after the uprising, hoping to understand the anger firsthand. He listened to young men tell him that nonviolence meant nothing if the police could beat them without consequence. He heard mothers describe raising children in buildings without heat in winter and without running water. He toured schools where classrooms had no science equipment or art programs. King realized that the movement needed to expand beyond desegregation and voting rights, because the root of injustice now centered on class, housing, wages, and policing. Government investigations followed the uprising. The McCone Commission concluded that poor education, unemployment, segregation, and police abuse caused the unrest, but its recommendations were largely ignored. The United States preferred policing and punishment over addressing structural racism. This failure guaranteed that future uprisings would erupt again and again. Detroit in 1967, Newark in 1967, and dozens of other cities would soon explode under the same pressures. The Watts uprising revealed that the civil rights movement's next chapter would require confronting economic inequality and northern racism, not just southern segregation. The Watts uprising left a deep psychological imprint on the civil rights movement, widening ideological debates between nonviolent activists and those calling for more radical solutions. Many African American leaders believe the uprising represented a warning sign, proof that young black Americans were losing faith that peaceful protest alone could deliver dignity and opportunity. After years of sermons, marches, and negotiations, their neighborhoods looked the same: crumbling apartments, overcrowded schools, and rising unemployment. Police brutality persisted despite legal reforms. This reality fueled the growing appeal of Black Power, a term that Stokely Carmichael would popularize just a year later. For SNCC members, Watts validated their belief that the struggle needed to evolve. They argued that the civil rights movement had focused too heavily on Southern courtroom victories and not enough on Northern economic injustice. They believed African Americans must take control of local institutions, build their own leadership structures, and stop depending on white liberal support. These ideas frightened moderates who worried that public opinion might turn against the movement if protests became more confrontational. But for many youth, nonviolence seemed like a luxury that ignored human pain. They respected King, but felt his approach could not dismantle entrenched inequality in cities. Martin Luther King Jr. viewed the uprising through both sorrow and empathy. He condemned the violence, believing it hurt the moral effectiveness of the movement. But he also warned America not to use the destruction as justification to ignore racism. King famously stated that a riot is the language of the unheard, explaining that people erupt when systems deny them any peaceful avenue for redress. He insisted the solution to riots was not more policing, but justice, jobs, decent housing, fair wages, and equal school funding. King now envisioned a movement targeting economic inequality nationwide. The Watts uprising also reshaped police reform debates. Activists demanded civilian review boards to investigate brutality, better training standards, and increased hiring of black officers. However, police departments resisted, defending themselves through union protection and political alliances. Cities allocated more funds to law enforcement rather than social programs. expanding police weaponry and surveillance capabilities. Ironically, efforts to contain future rebellions strengthen law enforcement's power while leaving poverty unchanged. Cultural consequences also emerge from Watts. Writers, musicians, and poets channeled the uprising's energy into artistic expression. Jazz and soul musicians released songs reflecting urban grief and determination. Novelists described life in segregated neighborhoods, revealing human depth behind statistics. The uprising fueled media interest in black art, helping launch cultural movements that embraced African heritage and challenged stereotypes. The emotional weight of Watts also influenced white Americans. Some became more sympathetic, recognizing structural inequality for the first time. Others hardened in opposition, calling for harsher policing and supporting politicians who promised to restore order. The divide between those seeking justice and those seeking control widened dramatically, shaping national politics for decades. In many ways, Watts marked the end of an era. The romantic optimism that followed the march on Washington faded, replaced by complex realities. America learned that civil rights legislation could change the law, but not erase inequality overnight. Activists discovered that victory required more than courtroom wins. It required transforming everyday life, jobs, neighborhoods, and social structure. Watts also signaled that the movement's next stage would be more difficult, more divided, and more explosive. As the 1960s continued, the civil rights movement stood at a crossroad. It had made extraordinary legal progress in the South, yet structural racism persisted everywhere. Leaders debated how to move forward. Was the answer moral persuasion, political power, community control, or economic revolution? These questions defined the next phase of the struggle, setting the stage for the rise of Black Power, the Poor People's Campaign, and the tragic wave of assassinations that would shake the nation at the decade's end. By the mid to late 1960s, a dramatic ideological shift was reshaping the civil rights movement. Younger activists, frustrated by slow progress and tired of appeasing white moderates, began embracing the revolutionary language of Black Power. This concept, energizing, bold, and controversial, challenged the nation's foundational belief that integration was the only path to equality. Black Power did not reject integration entirely. Rather, it demanded that African Americans gain control over their communities, define their own identities, and protect themselves from state violence. The term confronted a painful truth. While segregation signs were disappearing, racism was reinventing itself in the form of unemployment, failing schools, police brutality, and economic segregation. The younger generation wanted more than legal equality. They wanted liberation and dignity on their own terms. The phrase Black Power gained national attention in June 1966 during the Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi. James Meredith, who had broken the color barrier at the University of Mississippi, attempted to walk alone through the state to prove African Americans need not fear the South. On the second day, he was shot and wounded by a white supremacist. Civil rights organizations continued the march in his name. As crowds swelled, Stokely Carmichael, a rising SNCC leader, electrified audiences when he shouted, "We want Black Power." The phrase echoed through the crowd like thunder. It represented a break from previous messaging centered on interracial harmony. Many young activists believed that love and patience were no longer enough. They wanted political representation, cultural pride, and community ownership. Carmichael argued that African Americans should stop begging white politicians for freedom. Instead, they should run for office, own businesses, control schools, and manage local decision-making. Black Power encouraged Black pride. Afros, African clothing, cultural names, and traditions flourished. For centuries, African American identity had been shaped under the oppressive gaze of white society. Black Power turned that gaze inward, encouraging self-love. The slogan "Black is beautiful," revolutionary at the time, rejected racist stereotypes that had harmed generations. The movement insisted that darker skin, natural hair, and African ancestry were sources of strength and identity. Predictably, mainstream America reacted with fear and misunderstanding. Newspapers painted Black Power as racist and violent. Politicians accused activists of rejecting democracy. Even some civil rights leaders worried the term would scare potential allies and weaken support for legal reforms. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized the emotional truth behind Black Power, but feared the slogan might harden racial divisions. Yet King also acknowledged the movement's legitimacy. He understood that frustrating economic inequality demanded new solutions. For many youth, Black Power offered something deeply personal, emotional respect. They were tired of being told to wait, to stay calm, to love their enemies, and to trust white America to eventually do the right thing. Their communities still lived in poverty decades after emancipation, still faced underfunded schools, and still feared police brutality. Watching nonviolent activists beaten in the streets made self-defense appear necessary rather than radical. Black Power reminded African Americans that survival required strength. That feeling, combined with political momentum, opened the door for a new chapter in the civil rights movement, one embodied most dramatically by the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded in Oakland, California, in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, emerged from the same atmosphere that fueled Black Power activism. Newton and Seale were young, intelligent, and deeply aware of urban struggle. They saw black children attending inferior schools, families suffering under slumlords, men denied access to stable employment, and communities terrorized by police violence. They believed traditional civil rights organizations focused too heavily on legislation and not enough on daily protection. The Panthers sought to defend black neighborhoods, uplift community pride, and expose policing for what it had become: state control over racial minorities. The Panthers' early strategy shocked the nation: legally armed citizen patrols. With rifles slung across their shoulders and law books in hand, Panthers followed police cars in Oakland, observing arrests to ensure officers did not violate citizens' rights. Their uniforms, black leather jackets, berets, sunglasses, became iconic symbols of confidence and defiance. Most Americans had never seen an organized black group openly carrying firearms in public while quoting constitutional law. To many African Americans, the Panthers represented hope and safety. To the government, they represented threat. In a country built on racial fear, heavily armed black citizens produced political panic. Yet the Panthers were far more than media images. They created survival-based community programs: free breakfast for school children, health clinics, legal aid services, clothing drives, elder transportation, and after-school education. These initiatives filled desperate gaps left by government neglect. Thousands of children across the United States ate breakfast because of the Panthers. Their clinics provided sickle cell anemia testing and taught community members about nutrition and mental health. The Panthers believed liberation meant not only resisting oppression, but also healing their own communities from within. Their 10-point program demanded decent housing, education that taught true history, full employment, and an end to police brutality. Birmingham marked a turning point because it forced Americans to witness the moral stakes of racism. Many Northern whites who once saw civil rights issues as distant criticisms could no longer avoid the truth. International observers, including world leaders, condemned America's hypocrisy. The Cold War context made racial inequality especially damaging to national reputation. The United States claimed leadership over human rights and democracy while allowing racial violence to dominate its cities. The Soviet Union used these events in propaganda, making civil rights progress not only a moral necessity, but a political one. King and other leaders recognized that the Birmingham movement needed to be transformed into a national push for federal legislation. Through months of traveling, writing, preaching, and organizing, they prepared for what would become the March on Washington. The Birmingham demonstrations turned King into a powerful symbol, not merely a Southern pastor, but a national moral voice. His philosophy now reached universities, television studios, and policymakers. Churches across the nation sent financial support. Young activists saw Birmingham as proof that risk produced change. The campaign also influenced MalcolmX, who sharply criticized the nonviolent strategy but acknowledged its effectiveness in revealing American racism. He argued that Birmingham showed white America's true face. Malcolm remained skeptical about peaceful protest, yet the exposed brutality helped accelerate radical black consciousness. While King spoke of harmony, Malcolm warned that violence existed beneath the American dream. These contrasting visions increased national debate and awakened deeper understanding of racism's complexity. As the civil rights movement moved beyond Birmingham, activists carried lessons forward: the power of media exposure, the value of coordinated mass action, the importance of youth involvement, and the need for federal intervention. The Birmingham campaign represented both a victory and a reminder that the struggle was far from over. The nation stood on a moral precipice. Change was coming, pushed by courage and sacrifice, but the forces of hatred were not defeated. The Children's Crusade and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing created emotional urgency that reshaped the American conscience. Many Americans, finally outraged by what they had witnessed, demanded legal reform. The White House recognized the crisis as a turning point. Soon, civil rights legislation would move in a national focus. Birmingham had not only shaken Alabama, it had shaken the soul of the United States. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, held on August 28, 1963, stands as one of the most iconic events in American history, not simply because of its size, but because of its symbolism and emotional force. Before the march became reality, there were numerous fears and disagreements among leaders about whether the event was wise. Some politicians believed that bringing hundreds of thousands of protesters into the nation's capital could lead to riots or federal backlash. Others worried that different organizations within the civil rights movement would create arguments about goals, leadership, and messaging. Yet despite hesitation, momentum grew. Civil rights leaders knew the nation had reached a crucial moment. Birmingham revealed America's racial sickness, and many believed only a bold demonstration could push Congress toward meaningful legislation. The march was not just a gathering in the Capitol. It was a years-long dream shaped by earlier activism. Philip Randolph, a veteran labor leader, had proposed a march on Washington back in the 1940s to protest discrimination in war industries. Although the earlier march was canceled after government negotiations, the idea persisted. In 1963, Randolph partnered with the younger and charismatic Bayard Rustin, a brilliant strategist who organized transportation, crowd safety, sound systems, volunteer management, and program scheduling. Rustin faced prejudice due to his sexual orientation and past affiliations, but his organizational skills were unmatched. Under his direction, thousands of buses, trains, and car caravans were coordinated to bring people to Washington peacefully. The march focused on two linked themes: jobs and freedom. African Americans face staggering unemployment rates, low wages, and workplace discrimination even outside the South. Segregation limited access to good jobs and to training programs, meaning that economic instability followed black families across generations. Civil rights groups insisted that justice required more than desegregating schools or lunch counters. It required financial equality. The march demanded a living wage, unemployment insurance, and federal programs to lift communities out of poverty. These demands echoed across the National Mall through banners, speeches, and songs. On the morning of the event, crowds began arriving before sunrise. They flowed through Washington from every direction. Teenagers holding homemade signs, veterans marching with old medals, churches carrying choir banners, students waving American flags, and white allies walking beside black neighbors. By noon, over 250,000 people stood before the Lincoln Memorial, facing the reflecting pool under a bright summer sky. It was the largest demonstration in American history to that point. The march represented unity beyond anything the movement had previously achieved. Leaders from numerous organizations, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, NAACP, and the National Urban League, stood together even though they did not always agree on strategy. Speakers represented diverse approaches to resistance, from fiery calls for structural change to faith-based appeals for love. Celebrities like Harry Belafonte, Josephine Baker, and Bob Dylan also participated, recognizing the march as a cultural turning point. For many Americans watching live on television, the scale of the march shattered the myth that civil rights activism was a fringe movement. It proved that millions desired a more equal future, and that African Americans were not alone in their dream for justice. The march built emotional pressure around Congress, and it changed public imagination. People carried the hope that America could finally rebuild itself into a nation living up to its founding promises. The march was not just a protest, it was a declaration that equality was no longer negotiable. Although the March on Washington is widely remembered for Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, the event itself contained a broad orchestra of voices and messages that shaped a new national understanding of civil rights. One of the most significant speakers was John Lewis, leader of SNCC, who at only 23 years old represented the younger generation. Originally, Lewis wrote a powerful and radical speech criticizing the slow pace of federal action. Older activists feared the speech was too confrontational and might alienate the Kennedy administration. SNCC members insisted the speech reflect the urgency of their struggle. After intense negotiation, Lewis softened some language, yet maintained a sharp tone that demanded change rather than polite patience. His presence symbolized the movement's internal debates: how far to push, how fast to move, and how to balance respectability with truth. Female activists also played key roles, though many were limited by sexist expectations of the era. Dorothy Height, a powerful leader from the National Council of Negro Women, worked tirelessly in planning but was not given a speaking role. Women like Diane Nash, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer shaped strategy behind the scenes, yet male leadership often dominated public narratives. Their absence from the podium revealed gender inequality even within movements seeking justice. Still, women marched, sang, and organized in massive numbers, making the event function smoothly. The music performed during the march added emotional depth that transcended speeches. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson delivered a stunning performance that brought many listeners to tears, especially with "How I Got Over." Her voice carried centuries of suffering and faith, reminding everyone that the African American struggle was rooted in survival, resilience, and spiritual strength. Folk and freedom songs helped unify the crowd, turning thousands of strangers into a single community through rhythm and melody. Music reminded participants that civil rights was not only political, but cultural. Change required people to feel connected as human beings. When Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium, the atmosphere shifted. His speech was originally prepared to be cautious and policy-centered, but in the moment, King felt the emotional electricity around him. Near the end of his prepared text, Mahalia Jackson called out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream." King set aside his script and began speaking from the heart. His dream envisioned a world where black and white children could join hands, where justice rolled like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The speech stitched together biblical imagery, American founding ideals, and poetic storytelling. It was not simply a speech, it was a vision of moral transformation. Millions who watched on television felt stirred by its language and rhythm. King did not describe a future of revenge or bitterness. He described a future shaped by love, fairness, and equality under law. The speech resonated because it articulated a spiritual truth. Racism damaged the soul of the oppressor as deeply as the oppressed. This message allowed many white Americans to empathize with the movement, removing fears that equality meant destruction of their identity. The march concluded peacefully, disproving police predictions of chaos. Throughout the day, the atmosphere remained disciplined and hopeful. People went home believing they had changed history, and to a great extent, they had. The March on Washington ignited momentum that political leaders could not ignore. It demonstrated that the movement was national, powerful, organized, and morally grounded. The government now faced clear pressure to turn civil rights demands into law. Afterward, some activists, especially within SNCC, felt the march did not go far enough. They believed powerful speeches alone could not dismantle centuries of injustice. Yet, both radicals and moderates admitted that the march transformed the movement's public image forever. It amplified voices, awakened allies, and shook the country into deeper awareness. The nation had heard the dream. Soon, it would be asked to accept responsibility for making that dream real. The long-term impact of the march on Washington extended far beyond the summer of 1963. While activists celebrated success, political challenges remained immense. President John F. Kennedy, impressed by the peaceful demonstration and pressure by public opinion, pushed for sweeping civil rights legislation. His proposal aimed to end segregation in public spaces, strengthen school integration efforts, and protect voting rights. However, the bill faced fierce resistance in Congress, especially from Southern senators who used filibusters to block progress. The Democratic Party itself was divided, with Southern Democrats committed to preserving white supremacy, even if it meant opposing their own president. The movement recognized that mass demonstrations had changed hearts, but the next battle would require changing laws. Meanwhile, African American communities faced rising violence as white supremacist groups sought revenge for national exposure. Churches were bombed, organizers were followed by police, and activists received death threats at night. Some movement leaders believed the government must do more than negotiate. It must protect lives. The NAACP, SCLC, and SNCC argued that moral pleas needed to be matched by federal enforcement. Without protection, progress would remain fragile. The March on Washington also reshaped identity and pride within Black America. Seeing thousands gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, united in dignity, changed how many African Americans viewed themselves. They realized they belonged not to the margins of history, but to its center. Families who had endured generations of poverty and humiliation saw a path opening for their children. Students returned to classrooms with new confidence. Churches reported increased membership. Newspapers created youth columns that celebrated Black voices. A new language of empowerment began spreading across communities. Even so, tension simmered beneath the movement's surface. Some activists believed nonviolent integrationism could solve only part of the problem. MalcolmX dismissed the march as a performance controlled by white liberals, calling it the farce on Washington. Though his words were controversial and painful for many, they highlighted important questions. Could African Americans trust the same nation that enslaved them to deliver justice? Would laws alone eliminate racism? Was the Dream King described achievable through negotiation, or would deeper confrontation be necessary? These debates intensified over time, expanding political thought among Black youth who rejected passive suffering. International reactions to the march were dramatic. Newspapers in Africa, Asia, and Europe praised the movement's courage. Anti-colonial leaders saw a mirror between their independence struggles and the African American fight against state oppression. The United States, seeking global influence, understood that racial injustice weakened diplomatic strength. Civil rights became a key component of foreign policy because neglecting it damaged America's credibility. The march heightened this tension by revealing how deeply domestic racism endangered global reputation. As fall approached, the emotional high of August gave way to sobering reality. The Civil Rights Act still required passage. Poverty still crushed Black neighborhoods. Police brutality continued unchecked. But one truth had changed. No American could claim ignorance anymore. Millions watched the march live, heard King speak, and saw the diversity of protesters standing in unity. The event shattered myths of Black inferiority and demonstrated intellectual, cultural, and political strength on a national scale. The march marked a turning point because it reshaped the future rather than merely commenting on the present. It created a national expectation that law must change. It showed that African Americans were not pleading, They were demanding citizenship, and it inspired countless individuals who would later shape history. High school students became SNCC leaders, ministers became organizers, and ordinary workers became political visionaries. The March on Washington echoed across future decades, influencing movements for women's rights, LGBTQ plus equality, disability rights, anti-war protests, immigrant rights, and indigenous sovereignty. It provided a blueprint for coalition building, organized, peaceful, strategic, and emotionally compelling. The dream described in Washington did not end discrimination or violence, but it provided the moral roadmap. It told America what justice looked like, sounded like, and felt like. And even now, generations later, people still return to King's words, believing that freedom, though delayed, remains possible through collective effort. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not an overnight achievement, nor was it the result of a single march or a single leader. Instead, it represented the culmination of decades of struggle, sacrifice, legal battles, organizing brilliance, and relentless courage demonstrated by African American communities across the United States. The act was a legislative earthquake that rocked the foundations of segregation, outlawed discrimination in public facilities, employment, and education, and widened the pathway toward racial equality. But to understand how monumental this law was, one must first understand the fierce resistance that surrounded it. Following the March on Washington, the movement pushed the United States government into a political spotlight it could not escape. President John F. Kennedy, deeply moved by the march and increasingly aware of America's global hypocrisy, introduced a sweeping civil rights bill to Congress. His assassination on November 22, 1963, however, threatened the bill's future. The nation entered a state of mourning, and many feared that civil rights legislation would be postponed indefinitely. Kennedy's death shook the movement psychologically. Leaders questioned whether progress would collapse under the political weight of a grieving nation. Yet tragedy also inspired resolve. Civil rights activists insisted that passing the bill would honor Kennedy's legacy. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, shocked the country when he used his first major presidential address to argue for civil rights legislation. The federal government saw the Panthers as a direct threat. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called them the greatest danger to internal security. Hoover feared that their ability to unify black communities could reshape national politics. Under CONTLPRO, a secret counterintelligence program, the FBI launched surveillance, infiltration, and disinformation campaigns to destroy the Panthers. Agents forged letters to create mistrust within leadership, encouraged rivalries between organizations, planted informants, and manipulated the press. Police raided Panther offices across the country, often killing members. Fred Hampton, an inspiring young leader from Chicago, was assassinated in his sleep during a police raid aided by an FBI informant. Hampton, only 21, was famous for uniting black, white, and Latino working-class activists into a rainbow coalition. His assassination demonstrated how terrified the government was of cross-racial unity grounded in class struggle. Despite attacks, the Panthers influenced national culture. They reshaped language around police violence, forcing Americans to discuss brutality as systemic, not accidental. They inspired pride in blackness and cultural awareness through fashion, film, poetry, and newspapers. The Panthers' presence in northern and western cities changed political infrastructure, helping elect black mayors and shaping activism for decades. They represented a form of liberation rooted not in appealing to white conscience, but in building independent community power. Though heavily repressed by the state, the Panthers proved that grassroots organizing could transform despair into collective strength. Johnson, a Texan familiar with Southern politics, understood the enormous task ahead. He had to persuade Southern senators, many from his own party, to support a bill that directly challenged segregationist power structures. With political skill, emotional persuasion, and historical framing, Johnson declared that no memorial oration could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill, for which he fought so long. His speech signaled to the nation that the White House was committed to change. Debate over the bill consumed Congress for months. Southern senators launched what would become the longest filibuster in Senate history. Nearly 60 working days of nonstop obstruction. They argued that federal involvement in state affairs violated constitutional principles, and that racial integration would destroy Southern culture. Across the South, white supremacists intensified violence and intimidation campaigns. Churches were attacked, activists threatened, and voter registration efforts met with vicious retaliation. This climate of terror revealed how deeply resistance to civil rights was rooted in fear of losing racial hierarchy. Yet support for the bill grew nationwide. Religious groups, women's organizations, students, unions, journalists, and celebrities urged Congress to act. African American parents wrote heartbreaking letters describing their children forced into inferior schools and denied opportunities. Newspapers published images of protesters beaten in the streets of Birmingham and arrested in sit-ins across the South. These stories reshaped public opinion, demonstrating that segregation was not mere tradition but deliberate cruelty. The bill became more than law. It became a moral test. America had to answer whether freedom was reserved for a privileged class or promised to all. The struggle leading to the Civil Rights Act revealed the enormous distance between the values America preached and the reality it practiced. Just as abolitionists had confronted slavery a century earlier, civil rights activists confronted the shame of segregation and refused to retreat. When the Civil Rights Act finally passed on July 2, 1964, the moment marked a new chapter in American identity. It was a monumental triumph, but also a beginning rather than an endpoint, because laws alone could not erase centuries of racism, poverty, or hatred. Still, the act carved a historic legal pathway toward the world King dreamed of, a world where dignity and choice replace humiliation and exclusion. The contents of the Civil Rights Act were revolutionary in their specificity. The act outlawed segregation in theaters, restaurants, hotels, parks, schools, libraries, and any business or institution connected to interstate commerce. It mandated equal employment opportunities, establishing the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to investigate discrimination in hiring, firing, and promotion. For the first time, federal law recognized that racism was not only immoral, but an actionable violation of constitutional rights. Title II banned segregation in public accommodations. Title VI authorized the federal government to withhold funding from discriminatory programs. And Title VII targeted workplace inequalities, transforming the American job landscape. These provisions changed everyday life. African Americans who once sat in colored-only waiting rooms walked into integrated spaces. Restaurants that had violently rejected black customers were now legally obligated to serve them. Many people who had spent their entire lives under Jim Crow felt shock, pride, and disbelief when they first ate alongside white citizens without immediate harassment. The law cracked open cultural norms that many believed were permanent. Yet social transformation did not happen smoothly or immediately. Millions of white Americans clung to racist beliefs inherited through generations. Some businesses closed rather than integrate. Restaurant owners refused to comply until federal marshals forced them. White citizens staged protests with Confederate flags, shouting that integration violated their way of life. Schools in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi invented delaying tactics, attempting to avoid compliance. Some states passed new laws trying to disguise segregation under different names, hoping to trick the federal government. Segregationists fought ferociously to preserve racial order, proving that hatred did not vanish simply because Congress passed legislation. Meanwhile, African Americans felt both relief and frustration. Although the law opened doors, it did not ensure safety. Many black workers feared losing their jobs if they filed discrimination complaints. Employers threatened retaliation or used subtle tactics, such as unequal scheduling or fabricated criticism. Housing discrimination continued because the Civil Rights Act did not specifically address real estate racism. Many middle-class African-American families struggled to move into white neighborhoods because realtors refused to show homes or banks denied loans. Racism evolved into more complicated forms, less visible but equally destructive. Still, the law offered tools activists could use. Lawyers filed lawsuits demanding compliance. Students documented violations and forced federal investigation. Community leaders educated workers about their rights. Churches held meetings explaining the act, teaching congregations how to report misconduct. Activists now had legal grounding, making the movement stronger and more confident. Another crucial effect of the act was psychological. African Americans, long taught to accept inferiority, saw undeniable proof that the government recognized their humanity. Children growing up after 1964 entered a world with less institutional humiliation than their parents had endured. They could attend museums, sit at public counters, and apply for jobs previously closed to them. The Civil Rights Act represented hope turned into legal reality. The media continued shaping national consciousness. Television anchors explained the new law nightly. Reporters interviewed white business owners refusing to comply, and documentary teams filmed scenes of integration taking hold. Americans debated what equality meant. Was it simply access, or should it include economic restructuring? Some white moderates embraced the new law as an end to racial conflict, failing to grasp that deeper inequality. Housing segregation, police brutality, and generational poverty remained untouched. The Civil Rights Act also influenced activists abroad. Anti-apartheid leaders in South Africa watched with interest, seeing potential models to dismantle white supremacy. In Europe, intellectuals studying race relations cited the act as evidence that democracy could reform itself. Through global attention, the Civil Rights Act became an international emblem, representing a nation wrestling with its conscience. Although the act created enormous progress, many African Americans soon realized that having equal access to public spaces without equal access to political power would limit change. This realization gave rise to the next major struggle, voting rights. Because African Americans were still blocked from voting across much of the South, the Civil Rights Act alone could not guarantee democracy. And so, the movement prepared for another battle, one that would unfold in the streets of Selma. While many Americans celebrated the Civil Rights Act, activists knew that legal equality meant little without the ability to vote. Across the South, African Americans remained almost completely excluded from politics through a combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, fraudulent rejection of applications, and outright violence. In Mississippi, for example, less than 7% of eligible African Americans were registered to vote in 1964. In Alabama, local officials used impossible tasks, such as reading obscure constitutional passages, guessing how many voter applications were in a jar, or answering trick history questions graded subjectively. Even educated black teachers and college graduates routinely failed. Registration officers simply tore up forms while smiling. Law enforcement played a brutal role. Sheriffs photographed applicants, published their names, and informed employers who then fired them. Black sharecroppers who attempted to register lost access to farmland or credit. Those who persisted risked lynching. Police departments in many towns worked alongside white supremacist groups, coordinating violence to ensure the black vote never materialized. This environment of terror made clear that without federal protection, African Americans would never gain equal political voice. SNCC volunteers, along with Corps and local church leaders, began preparing massive voter registration campaigns. They traveled door to door at great personal risk, encouraging people to believe change was possible. Many SNCC activists were in their late teens or early 20s, living on tiny salaries or none at all, sleeping in strangers' homes, and walking dusty rural roads. Their courage defied the narrative that young people were apathetic. They were frontline soldiers in a war for democracy. In 1964, these efforts produced Freedom Summer, a massive campaign centered in Mississippi that brought hundreds of college students, black and white, from around the country to help African Americans register to vote. Freedom Summer volunteers taught literacy, established community centers, and documented violent suppression tactics. Their presence made local officials furious. The threat of outsider involvement led to intensified attacks. Churches were burned, community centers raided, and volunteers stalked at night. On June 21, 1964, three activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, went missing in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Their disappearance captured national attention, sparking frantic investigations. Weeks later, the bodies of the three men were discovered buried in an earthen dam, murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan with assistance from local police. Their deaths horrified the nation and demonstrated yet again that white supremacy operated with official protection. The murders became a turning point, convincing many Americans that racial violence was not a Southern stereotype, but a catastrophic reality. The Civil Rights Act had outlawed segregation, but Mississippi revealed that racism lived deeper than signs on bathrooms or bus seats. It lived in the power to decide who belonged in government and who remained silent. It lived in the fear that prevented black parents from walking into courthouses to demand ballot access. It lived in federal hesitancy to confront local tyranny. Freedom Summer also birthed new political structures, such as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged segregated state delegations at the Democratic National Convention. Fannie Lou Hamer's televised testimony exposing violent voter suppression moved countless viewers, but party leaders compromised, offering symbolic seats rather than real change. Many activists left the convention feeling betrayed, convinced that American democracy needed deeper reconstruction. Yet these struggles also strengthened the movement's resolve. They revealed the next battlefield clearly. If African Americans could not vote safely and freely, then all prior victories would remain vulnerable. Activists began shifting national focus towards Selma, Alabama, a place where the fight for voting rights would ignite historic confrontation and lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The fight for voting rights in Selma, Alabama, stands as one of the most dramatic and morally revealing chapters of the civil rights movement. By 1965, segregation had been legally weakened, but racism remained structurally embedded throughout the South. The Civil Rights Act outlawed public segregation, yet African Americans still faced overwhelming difficulty registering to vote. Selma, located in Dallas County, became the national symbol of this fight because of its extreme racial inequality. Although African Americans made up more than half of the county's population, only around 2% were registered to vote. Local officials used every possible tactic to maintain this imbalance. Sheriff Jim Clark, infamous for his cruelty, wore a small gold lapel pin that read "Never," making clear he never intended to allow black voting rights. Clark and his deputies routinely beat protesters, stormed registration lines, and arrested people simply for standing outside the courthouse. Under his watch, Selma became a place where democracy itself was held hostage by brutality. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, already experienced in national activism, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, deeply rooted in grassroots organizing, both recognized Selma as a strategic location. Many activists left the convention feeling betrayed, convinced that American democracy needed deeper reconstruction. Yet these struggles also strengthened the movement's resolve. They revealed the next battlefield clearly. If African Americans could not vote safely and freely, then all prior victories would remain vulnerable. Activists began shifting national focus towards Selma, Alabama, a place where the fight for voting rights would ignite historic confrontation and lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The fight for voting rights in Selma, Alabama, stands as one of the most dramatic and morally revealing chapters of the civil rights movement. By 1965, segregation had been legally weakened, but racism remained structurally embedded throughout the South. The Civil Rights Act outlawed public segregation, yet African Americans still faced overwhelming difficulty registering to vote. Selma, located in Dallas County, became the national symbol of this fight because of its extreme racial inequality. Although African Americans made up more than half of the county's population, only around 2% were registered to vote. Local officials used every possible tactic to maintain this imbalance. Sheriff Jim Clark, infamous for his cruelty, wore a small gold lapel pin that read "Never," making clear he never intended to allow black voting rights. Clark and his deputies routinely beat protesters, stormed registration lines, and arrested people simply for standing outside the courthouse. Under his watch, Selma became a place where democracy itself was held hostage by brutality. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, already experienced in national activism, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, deeply rooted in grassroots organizing, both recognized Selma as a strategic location. The two organizations had very different styles. SNCC was younger, more radical, more embedded in local communities, while SCLC followed the moral leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. Their previous collaboration had sometimes been tense, especially in Mississippi, but Selma demanded unity. Activists understood that if they could break voter suppression in Selma, the victory would echo across the South. They also believed that dramatic confrontation would expose the hypocrisy of American democracy to the world. Beginning in January 1965, activists launched daily attempts to register voters. People lined up outside the courthouse for hours, facing cold weather, verbal abuse, and endless rejection. Clerks invented new rules each day to deny registration, from spelling tests to elaborate questionnaires. Those who managed to fill forms correctly were told to return months later for decisions that never arrived. Teachers who appeared at the courthouse were fired. Employees were dismissed from jobs at insurance companies, factories, and farms. Sharecroppers risked losing their homes. Still, black residents kept returning because they believed voting meant dignity. Federal attention increased when King arrived in Selma later that month. His presence drew reporters, photographers, and television news crews. King understood the importance of moral drama. He knew national outrage was a powerful weapon. Soon after, he and hundreds of demonstrators marched toward the courthouse and were arrested. While in jail, King wrote that Selma exposed the difference between legal equality and lived equality. The Civil Rights Act gave African Americans access to lunch counters, but without a vote, they lacked the ability to influence schools, policing, roads, taxes, and elected institutions. Selma revealed the truth that political rights, not just social rights, were the foundation of freedom. As more protests unfolded, local authorities escalated violence. Peaceful marchers were shoved, beaten, dragged by collars, and threatened with guns. Elderly women were pushed down courthouse steps. Teenagers were punched and cursed at. Church meetings were infiltrated by informants. The white supremacist network around Selma ran deep, connected to local businesses, police forces, and state politics. The hostility reached a breaking point when Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young black activist trying to protect his mother during a protest in nearby Marion, was shot by an Alabama state trooper. Jackson later died from his wounds, his blood fueling demands for a massive march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, a march intended to call for federal voting protections. Selma was no longer just a city. It was a battleground for the future of American democracy. The decision to march from Selma to Montgomery represented both strategy and symbolism. Activists believed a public march to the state capital would reveal the depth of injustice and compel the national government to finally enact a voting rights law. The march would span roughly 54 miles, crossing rural areas historically stained with lynchings and racial terror. Organizers knew the danger was extraordinary. Sheriff Jim Clark, the Alabama troopers under Colonel Al Lingo, and Governor George Wallace openly promised resistance. Wallace declared that the march was illegal and claimed it would not be tolerated. Yet the brutality of Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder convinced civil rights leaders that the risk was necessary. On March 7th, 1965, around 600 peaceful marchers assembled at Brown Chapel AME Church. Many were local residents. Others were SNCC workers and SCLC volunteers. Their ages varied, from teenagers to elderly participants who had lived through decades of injustice. The group moved forward quietly, singing hymns and freedom songs. They crossed Selma's downtown district and approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate officer and Ku Klux Klan leader, a cruel and symbolic reminder of the historical forces they were confronting. As the marchers reached the crest of the bridge, they saw an overwhelming wall of state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and mounted officers blocking Highway 80. Tear gas canisters hung at the officers' sides like silent threats. Behind them stood white onlookers screaming insults. Major John Cloud of the state troopers ordered the activists to disperse, though the marchers stood silently, prepared for arrest, but not expecting what came next. Without further warning, Cloud ordered the attack. Troopers charged forward with clubs, bullwhips, and ropes. Tear gas exploded into clouds that blinded and suffocated marchers. People stumbled, choking, falling to the asphalt. Mounted officers on horseback galloped through the crowd, trampling bodies. Women threw themselves over children to absorb blows. John Lewis, leading SNCC, was struck brutally on the skull, fracturing his head. Years later, he remembered hearing the crack of his own bone. Television cameras filmed the horror, broadcasting the chaos across the nation that same night. Americans who turned on their TVs expecting Quiet Sunday programming instead witnessed a nightmare. Peaceful citizens crushed under violence by their own government. The scene became known as Bloody Sunday, and its images changed the national conversation instantly. No longer could politicians argue that civil rights activists exaggerated claims of brutality. No longer could moderates pretend reform could wait. Bloody Sunday exposed the machinery of white supremacy operating in broad daylight. Black Power and the Black Panther Party dramatically expanded the meaning of civil rights by shifting focus from integration to self-determination. While earlier movements had aimed primarily at legal equality, Black Power insisted that psychological liberation was equally important. Integration meant little if African Americans still viewed themselves through the lens of white acceptance. Black Power argued that freedom required mental decolonization, unlearning the belief that whiteness was the standard of beauty, intelligence, and worth. Schools began teaching African history, languages, and cultural traditions. College campuses witnessed uprisings demanding Black studies programs. Youth wore afros proudly, rejecting chemical straighteners that symbolized assimilation. Music changed too. Soul and funk exploded, celebrating African American heritage in a way mainstream culture could not ignore. However, the shift toward Black Power created tension within the movement. Some activists believed separatism risked isolating African Americans politically, making it harder to build broad coalitions. Moderates feared the Panthers' armed patrols would provoke violent backlash. Martin Luther King Jr. remained committed to nonviolence, but even he acknowledged that riots and revolutionary language did not arise from nowhere. They were reactions to oppression. King and Carmichael debated publicly, illustrating the movement's diversity rather than its division. History often simplifies the civil rights movement into two sides, nonviolent versus militant, but the reality was more intertwined. Many activists admired both strategies, believing liberation required multiple pathways. As the 1960s approached their end, the United States faced multiple crises: Vietnam, urban poverty, youth rebellion, and racial polarization. The war in Vietnam especially divided African American communities. The national reaction was immediate and explosive. Millions of Americans, including white families in northern suburbs who had never attended a protest, expressed shock and disgust. Reporters interviewed marchers with blood still streaming down their faces. Churches from across the country announced emergency solidarity marches. thousands began traveling to Alabama in support of the movement. King issued a public call for clergy, urging ministers, rabbis, priests, and nuns to join the next march. Religious leaders responded in overwhelming numbers, making Selma an interfaith moral uprising. The federal government, embarrassed and alarmed, scrambled to respond. President Lyndon Johnson, who supported civil rights but feared national instability, understood that Bloody Sunday had created a political point of no return. Civil rights leaders demanded federal protection to complete the march to Montgomery. Wallace refused, insisting that Alabama troops should maintain control, even though those same troops had beaten citizens on national television. The standoff escalated tension across the United States. Selma had become a moral crisis, forcing the country to decide whether it wanted democracy or segregation. In the days following Bloody Sunday, Selma transformed into a nationwide magnet for protest, solidarity, and confrontation. Martin Luther King Jr. organized a second march for March 9th, intended to show that activists would not be intimidated. This event became known as Turnaround Tuesday. Hundreds of new supporters arrived: white college students, Northern clergy, celebrities, union leaders, and thousands of ordinary Americans stirred by outrage. Their presence demonstrated that the civil rights movement was no longer isolated. It now belonged to a broad coalition that crossed racial, religious, and geographic boundaries. On Turnaround Tuesday, King led a crowd back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. However, because of a court order temporarily restraining the march while federal judges reviewed legal rights, King made a controversial decision. When confronted by Alabama troopers blocking the road, King knelt in prayer and then turned the marchers around, avoiding violent confrontation. Some activists, especially younger SNCC members, were furious. They felt betrayed, arguing that King had negotiated privately with federal officials and compromised the march's moral force. They believed that confronting danger directly was necessary to demonstrate injustice. Yet King insisted that risking another massacre without legal protection would weaken the movement's ability to secure voting rights. His action, though criticized, protected marchers from immediate danger and gave the courts time to act. The days between Bloody Sunday and the final march were filled with tension and tragedy. On the night of March 9th, Northern Minister James Reeb, who had answered King's call to join the struggle, was beaten by white attackers and later died. His death deepened national outrage, especially because he was white, proof that even allies were targets in the fight for justice. Many Americans who had once ignored racism found themselves unable to look away. The murder of Reeb became a powerful turning point, inspiring greater participation and pushing the federal government toward intervention. Meanwhile, activists camped, organized, and planned, waiting for a legal ruling that would determine whether they could proceed. On March 17th, Judge Frank Johnson ruled in favor of the marchers, declaring that their right to protest was constitutionally protected. The decision represented a monumental legal victory. Suddenly, the very system that once supported segregation now upheld activist rights. The ruling also authorized federal protection, setting the stage for a historic moment. On March 21st, 1965, the final Selma to Montgomery March began under the protection of the U.S. Army, federal marshals, and National Guard troops. Approximately 3,200 marchers started the journey, walking through farmland, sleeping in fields, and facing hostile white crowds along the roadside. Their spirits were lifted by songs, food prepared by volunteers, and speeches delivered under open skies. Although the march involved physical pain, swollen feet, exhaustion, and emotional strain, participants believed they were walking into history. The road itself felt symbolic. Each step represented centuries of struggle, from slave ships to Reconstruction, from lynching trees to segregated schools. By the time the march reached the outskirts of Montgomery, its size had grown to nearly 25,000 people. They approached the state capitol, where George Wallace had once vowed segregation would last forever. The scene was overwhelming. Black farmers, white priests, factory workers, college students, and elderly marchers stood together in unity. King delivered a powerful speech known as "How Long, Not Long," declaring that justice would triumph because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. His words echoed through Montgomery and across the world, symbolizing hope amid hardship. The Selma movement profoundly impacted national and political consciousness. Americans who had watched Bloody Sunday were now watching triumph. Selma forced Congress to confront the truth that democracy could not coexist with racial exclusion. On August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, a monumental achievement that outlawed voter suppression tactics, authorized federal oversight in discriminatory regions, and opened the ballot box to millions. Selma proved that moral courage could reshape the world, even against overwhelming violence. Selma also revealed that the movement's success belonged not only to famous leaders, but to ordinary people whose footsteps reshaped American history. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 stands beside the Civil Rights Act as one of the most transformative laws in American history. It represented the legal victory that generations of African Americans had fought and bled for, a victory written not just in ink, but in sacrifice, courage, and the memory of those who died demanding the right to vote. Before the act became reality, activists understood that the right to vote was the core of citizenship. Without voting power, African Americans remained vulnerable to the whims of state politicians, police brutality, unfair jury selections, and discriminatory tax systems. Voting touched every aspect of daily life. School funding, road development, hospital access, and policing decisions all depended on elected officials. Selma demonstrated that denying voting rights was not an accidental flaw. It was a calculated method to maintain racial hierarchy. The brutal beatings on the Edmund Pettus Bridge revealed to the world that oppression was violently enforced. When Lyndon B. Johnson delivered his dramatic speech to Congress on March 15, 1965, many Americans were stunned. The president's voice, broadcast across the nation, echoed the language of the movement itself. Johnson declared, "Their cause must be our cause too," and ended with the anthem of the movement, "We shall overcome." African Americans watching the speech wept openly because the phrase had long belonged to them. It was part of their songs, their marches, their jail cells. Hearing the nation's president speak those words was a sign that the struggle had entered a new era. The speech was not only political persuasion, it was a moral confession, acknowledging that the government had failed its black citizens and must now correct history. Congressional debate over the Voting Rights Act became intense. Southern leaders repeated familiar arguments. Federal involvement in elections violated states' rights. Integration threatened order, and black voters would corrupt politics. These excuses echoed earlier racist logic used to oppose emancipation, oppose Reconstruction, and oppose school integration. But the nation had changed. Bloody Sunday shifted public opinion dramatically. White moderates who once believed racism could be solved gradually now demanded federal intervention. Religious groups, universities, journalists, and labor unions pressured Congress to act quickly. The civil rights movement had built a national moral coalition too large to ignore. The Voting Rights Act attacked racist suppression directly. It banned literacy tests, which for years had humiliated African Americans and kept them out of political life. It also placed federal examiners in counties with histories of discrimination, ensuring that voter registration would not be blocked by false excuses. Perhaps most importantly, the law required states with documented discrimination to seek federal approval, pre-clearance, before changing voting rules. This prevented local governments from inventing new voter restrictions disguised under different names. For the first time in American history, black citizenship gained nationwide structural protection. The significance of the act cannot be overstated. It was not merely words on paper. It was a new social reality. African Americans who had grown up believing voting was impossible gathered outside courthouses, registering with smiles, laughter, and disbelief. Churches organized caravans to take elders to registration sites. Young men and women stood proudly in lines that stretched around blocks. In some counties, the number of black registered voters jumped from single digits to thousands within months. The South began shifting politically, not because white supremacy willingly let go, but because the law forced fairness into a system designed to exclude. Although the Voting Rights Act represented monumental progress, the road ahead remained complex. As African Americans began registering in large numbers, white segregationists searched desperately for new ways to preserve their power. Some county officials attempted to close registration offices or reduce business hours to discourage turnout. Others redrew district lines to dilute the influence of black voters. In certain regions, white citizens formed political clubs dedicated to electing sheriffs and judges who promised to resist integration quietly. Racism adapted to legislative change. It did not vanish. Still, the Act's enforcement mechanisms allowed civil rights lawyers and federal authorities to challenge these tactics. Meanwhile, the expansion of black voting rights transformed community psychology. Generations of African Americans who had been taught through violence that their voices held no value now discovered that their vote carried weight. Political campaigns visited black churches seeking endorsements. Local leaders encouraged African Americans to run for office. Many who once feared entering courthouses now walked proudly inside to cast ballots. Elderly sharecroppers who had spent their lives under Jim Crow told reporters that voting made them feel human for the first time. These stories demonstrated that the act reshaped identity, restoring dignity lost under centuries of oppression. The Voting Rights Act also altered political representation. Within a decade, hundreds of African Americans were elected to school boards, city councils, mayoral offices, and state legislatures. Black officials shaped policy on housing, healthcare, public works, and education. In places where black political leaders emerged, police departments hired more black officers. Schools received improved funding, and discriminatory laws were challenged. Although racism persisted, representation offered a new pathway to resist injustice through legal structures rather than through constant protest alone. The movement's leaders understood that activism would continue even after victory. Martin Luther King Jr., increasingly focused on economic inequality, argued that the next frontier was poverty. Malcolm X, shortly before his death, explained that voting rights meant little without social and economic control. SNCC activists, frustrated by federal delays and disappointed by political compromises, began pivoting toward more militant stances. They believed that true power required more than access to ballots. It required control of land, education, business, and culture. The impact of Selma also extended into global consciousness. Civil rights leaders traveled to Africa, speaking with anti-colonial governments who saw parallels between American racism and European imperialism. Leaders in South Africa fighting apartheid studied the American voting movement, drawing lessons for their own battles. Selma became an international symbol of how oppressed people could force change through organized courage and media strategy. Still, progress brought violent backlash. African American activists remained targets for bombings, shootings, beatings, and arson. Churches burned, homes exploded, and activists disappeared. The Ku Klux Klan attempted to terrorize communities back into silence. It did not work. Instead, violence solidified national disgust against white supremacy. Americans understood that resistance to change revealed more about the oppressors than the oppressed. The Voting Rights Act inspired countless ordinary people to believe in democracy again. For years, African Americans have been told repeatedly that law and government served only white interests. Now, federal enforcement invigorated belief that the Constitution could protect them. The act restored faith not only in politics, but in possibility. Ultimately, the Voting Rights Act did not solve every problem, but it corrected the most glaring contradiction in American democracy. Millions of citizens have been legally excluded from political participation because of their race. The law represented a moral awakening, signaling that the United States was redefining its identity, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Despite the tremendous hope inspired by the Voting Rights Act, African American communities soon faced new challenges. Racism did not dissolve simply because federal law changed. Economic inequality still shaped daily life. Black neighborhoods across the South and North alike struggled with underfunded schools, inadequate hospitals, and lack of employment opportunities. Many black students attended overcrowded classrooms with outdated books. Teachers, overworked and underpaid, had to fight to maintain morale. Parents, though hopeful because their children now had true citizenship rights, still worried that racism would limit their futures. Northern cities battled their own forms of segregation that laws could not easily resolve. White flight accelerated as white families moved from integrated cities to suburban communities protected by property taxes and zoning rules. As tax money left urban centers, schools, and infrastructure decayed, the Voting Rights Act could change ballots, but could not immediately change centuries of wealth imbalance. Many African American families, especially in rural regions, continued to live under grinding poverty. Some residents survived by picking cotton for low wages, living in housing without plumbing or heating. These painful realities revealed that voting rights were only the beginning of a longer journey. Inside the movement, ideological tensions deepened. SNCC, once deeply committed to interracial cooperation, became disillusioned. Many members argued that white liberals had too much influence over political decisions. Under leaders like Stokely Carmichael, SNCC moved toward black power ideology, emphasizing self-reliance, cultural pride, and political independence. They questioned whether integration alone could heal racial wounds. Malcolm X had planted seeds of skepticism before his assassination. He warned that integration required black people to surrender control to the same systems that oppressed them. His critiques gained new respect among young activists after Selma. The Voting Rights Act also provoked political realignment. Many white Southern Democrats felt betrayed by their own party and began shifting toward the Republican Party. This transformation reshaped the American political landscape for generations to come. The South, once a Democratic stronghold built on white supremacy, gradually became Republican-dominated as conservative politicians promised to protect law and order. This phrase, while framed as neutral policy, became coded language used to resist racial progress. The civil rights movement had not only changed laws, it changed the entire structure of American politics. As federal oversight continued, white supremacists attempted to adapt. Some counties gerrymandered black voters into districts designed to limit influence. Others introduced at-large election systems, ensuring that white majorities controlled city governments, even where black voters outnumbered white residents. The struggle revealed that law could guarantee rights, but vigilance was required to defend them. In spite of challenges, the Voting Rights Act carved paths for future leaders. Figures like John Lewis, who once bled on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, later served decades in the U.S. Congress. Black mayors emerged in cities like Cleveland, Newark, Detroit, Atlanta, and Birmingham. These leaders reshaped urban America, proving that political representation produced real change. Their victories symbolize the arc of history bending toward justice, not by accident, but by relentless human will. The Voting Rights Act did not close the civil rights movement. It opened a new chapter. African Americans could now challenge injustices through voting and office holding, shifting the fight from the streets to legislative halls. Yet the movement remained morally unfinished. The fight for jobs, equal housing, school equality, and police reform lay ahead. The next phase of the struggle would expose new battles: urban uprisings, black power, Vietnam War controversy, and the assassination of moral leaders. As the 1960s progressed, the nation would learn that democracy, once open to those denied it, changed more than the ballot box. It transformed imagination. African Americans began envisioning futures their ancestors were forbidden to dream. Voting rights had lit a flame, and the world would never be the same. While Martin Luther King Jr. became internationally known as the moral voice of nonviolent resistance, Malcolm X emerged as the sharp philosophical counterweight, challenging America and the civil rights movement with ideas that demanded deeper transformation. Malcolm's rise profoundly reshaped the intellectual landscape of the 1960s. His speeches, charisma, and uncompromising honesty attracted thousands, especially African Americans disillusioned with promises of slow progress. Young black men were drafted at disproportionate rates, sent to die for a country that denied them equality at home. This contradiction sparked massive anti-war sentiment within the movement. King himself spoke against the war in 1967, arguing that bombs dropped in Vietnam exploded in American ghettos by draining resources that could have relieved poverty. His stance angered President Johnson and many white supporters who believed civil rights leaders should remain silent about foreign policy. Black power groups embraced anti-imperialism openly, rejecting American foreign wars as extensions of racial capitalism. Black power also emphasized alliances beyond race. Contrary to stereotypes, many Panthers collaborated with white working-class groups, Native American activists, Chicano organizers, Asian American collectives, and anti-war student networks. These alliances suggested a broader revolution possible, one not based solely on race, but on shared struggle against exploitation. The government recognized this coalition-building potential and feared it deeply. Dividing groups became central to COINTELPRO strategies, so racial mistrust, demonized activists spread false narratives. Public perception of the Panthers remained complicated. Media coverage fixated on guns and confrontation while ignoring community programs. Hollywood stereotypes portrayed Black power as violent extremism. Yet those who lived in Panther-supported communities knew a different truth. Children were fed, elders received care, and police brutality was challenged publicly for the first time. As the decade drew to a close, the combined influence of Malcolm X, SNCC, and the Panthers reshaped Black consciousness permanently. Even though government pressure eventually weakened the Panthers, their cultural and political legacy endured. They widened the struggle's horizon, beyond integration, beyond legal reform, toward economic justice, cultural pride, and collective empowerment. Malcolm was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. His early life unfolded under the shadow of racial terror. His father, Earl Little, a minister inspired by Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement, died under suspicious circumstances, believed by many to have been murdered by white supremacists. His mother, Louise Little, was institutionalized when Malcolm was still young, pushing him and his siblings into foster homes. These early traumas shaped Malcolm's outlook, teaching him that the American system had little mercy for Black families trying to survive. As a teenager in Boston and Harlem, Malcolm drifted into street life, working odd jobs, then engaging in theft and gambling. His criminal lifestyle led to his arrest and a prison sentence in 1946. But prison did not destroy him. Instead, it awakened his intellectual potential. He studied history, religion, and philosophy obsessively. He joined the Nation of Islam, NOI, adopting its teachings of racial pride, moral discipline, and economic self-sufficiency. Malcolm discarded his last name, calling it a slave name, replacing it with X, symbolizing a lost ancestral identity. His transformation became one of the most compelling stories in American life. A man society discarded became a revolutionary thinker capable of shifting global conversations. When Malcolm left prison in 1952 and became a minister within the Nation of Islam, he quickly rose as a national spokesperson. His speaking style was unique, articulate, sharp, humorous, and unyielding. Malcolm condemned racism directly rather than appealing to conscience. He rejected integration as an end goal, arguing that African Americans should build independent institutions rather than relying on systems historically designed to exploit them. While many white Americans feared and misunderstood him, countless black Americans embraced his words because they mirrored lived experiences. Malcolm told people they were not inferior, not doomed to accept brutality, and not required to beg for respect. His speeches urged African Americans to love themselves, know their history, and defend their communities by any means necessary. To many, Malcolm's ideas sounded dangerous. To others, they sounded liberating. His criticism of nonviolence stood in stark contrast to King's philosophy. Malcolm argued that asking African Americans to remain peaceful while facing deadly violence was morally unrealistic. He believed every human being had the right to defend themselves. Yet Malcolm's message was not about random violence. It was about dignity and self-worth. He challenged white liberals who celebrated civil rights activism only when it was comfortable for them. He called out hypocrisy in northern cities, where African Americans faced housing discrimination, school inequality, and police brutality despite the absence of formal Jim Crow laws. Malcolm forced Americans to confront racism not as a regional quirk of the South, but as a national crisis. His presence changed the civil rights movement's cultural tone, expanding the definition of freedom far beyond integration alone. Although Malcolm X was often portrayed in the media as the militant opposite of King, the truth was more complex. Malcolm and King both understood that African Americans deserved full equality, political power, and dignity. Their disagreements centered on methods and timing, how quickly change should be pursued, and whether integration would ever be enough. Malcolm believed the United States, built on the profit of slavery, remained incapable of treating black people fairly without systemic reconstruction. He saw integration as an invitation to participate in a nation still rooted in white supremacy. King believed in the possibility of moral transformation through love. Malcolm believed liberation would require power, not sympathy. The Nation of Islam shaped Malcolm's early ideology with teachings that combined spiritual doctrine and social separatism. Headed by Elijah Muhammad, the NOI provided structure and discipline. Members avoided alcohol, drugs, adultery, and criminal activity. The organization opened businesses, schools, and farms, encouraging economic independence. For many African Americans, particularly those in northern ghettos, the NOI offered dignity. But critics accused the group of promoting racial hatred because it described white people collectively as oppressors. Malcolm defended this language by pointing to centuries of lynching, rape, and exclusion. He believed the problem was not individual white people, but a culture of domination. However, cracks formed between Malcolm and the NOI by the early 1960s. Malcolm's national fame grew rapidly, drawing attention and jealousy within the organization. He believed the NOI should take a more visible role in civil rights actions, but Elijah Muhammad refused, preferring isolation over mass protest. Malcolm also suffered personal disillusionment when he learned Muhammad had fathered children with several secretaries, violating spiritual rules Malcolm had defended publicly. This betrayal shook his trust. Tensions worsened when Malcolm commented on President Kennedy's assassination, calling it a case of the chickens coming home to roost, a remark Elijah Muhammad banned him from making. The statement intensified internal conflict, leading to Malcolm's suspension and eventual separation from the NOI. Malcolm's split from the NOI marked the beginning of remarkable intellectual evolution. Freed from organizational restrictions, he traveled internationally, especially to Africa and the Middle East, where he connected with newly independent nations emerging from colonial rule. In Mecca, Malcolm experienced profound spiritual transformation during his 1964 pilgrimage. He saw Muslims of all skin tones worshiping together, challenging his belief that all white people were inherently oppressive. He returned to the United States with a new name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, and a broader understanding of global brotherhood. Though he remained firm about black empowerment, his new worldview embraced cooperation among races willing to reject racism. He distinguished between white individuals who supported justice and white power structures rooted in exploitation. This transformation frightened both enemies and former allies. The FBI had tracked Malcolm for years, fearing the potential for black unity. After his ideological shift, he became even more threatening because his message now appealed to wider audiences, including moderates who once dismissed him. Malcolm founded new organizations, including the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, an organization of Afro-American unity, focusing on human rights rather than simply civil rights. He argued that African Americans should bring their struggle before the United Nations, framing racism as an international crime. His speeches became increasingly sophisticated, connecting capitalism, imperialism, and racism. Malcolm also reached out to SNCC activists, influencing younger leaders who were beginning to question traditional strategies. Yet Malcolm lived under constant danger. His home was firebombed. He received death threats from the NOI, from white supremacists, and from government agencies. Still, he refused to retreat. He believed silence was betrayal, and he continued speaking across colleges, churches, and community centers with urgency, as though aware his time was running short. MalcolmX represented a bridge between civil rights and black consciousness, a figure who challenged Americans to reconsider what liberation truly meant. Malcolm X's assassination on February 21st, 1965, inside the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, shook the civil rights movement deeply. He was just 39 years old. Gunmen associated with the Nation of Islam opened fire during a public rally, ending his life but not his influence. His death ignited conversations that continued for decades. Who was responsible? How deep was government involvement? What would Malcolm have achieved had he lived longer? For many African Americans, Malcolm became a martyr, proof that powerful black voices were always targeted by systems terrified of change. His legacy did not fade. It evolved, spreading into new movements that would reshape black identity throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. In death, Malcolm became even larger than he had been in life. His autobiography, written with journalist Alex Haley, offered readers an unparalleled look into his transformation, from a street hustler to a disciplined intellectual who reinvented himself with astonishing will. The book gave millions access to Malcolm's inner thoughts, making him relatable, human, and heroic. Young readers across the world discovered in Malcolm a mirror of their own frustrations with injustice. His emphasis on self-knowledge, history, and self-defense inspired a generation that no longer wanted to wait patiently for equality. Many felt Malcolm told the truth without fear, unfiltered by white comfort or political diplomacy. Malcolm's ideas resonated strongly with urban African Americans who lived outside the Southern civil rights framework. In northern cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Los Angeles, racism manifested differently, not through formal segregation signs, but through housing discrimination, police brutality, job exclusion, and failing schools. Malcolm spoke directly to these realities. He described slums as concentration camps, schools as indoctrination centers, and police as occupying forces. His language reflected frustration that King's victories in the South did not necessarily solve problems in the North. Malcolm opened doors for future leaders like Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis, and Stokely Carmichael. The rise of the Black Power movement after Malcolm's death showed how his ideas continued shaping political thought. When Carmichael shouted "Black Power" during the 1966 Mississippi March, he captured Malcolm's spirit, the call to define success on black terms, not based on white approval. Black Power emphasized pride, beauty, culture, afros, music, and African heritage. It encouraged black communities to build their own institutions, clinics, newspapers, legal defense funds, and breakfast programs. Groups like the Black Panther Party embraced Malcolm's belief in armed self-defense against police brutality. They patrolled streets, monitored officers, and demanded an end to racial violence. Malcolm also changed how black Americans viewed history. He demanded that schools teach African civilizations, resistance movements, and global black contributions. He argued that American society intentionally hid black excellence to maintain white dominance. His critiques influenced college curricula and helped inspire the creation of black studies programs across major universities. Students occupied administrative buildings, insisting that their education reflect their identity. Ironically, as Malcolm became admired by younger generations, Martin Luther King Jr. began moving ideologically closer to ideas Malcolm had once championed. King increasingly condemned capitalism, the Vietnam War, and Northern racism. He acknowledged that nonviolence alone could not overcome economic inequality. Though the two leaders rarely agreed in public, their legacies gradually converged, two visions of liberation that shaped a broader understanding of justice. Malcolm X's global influence also expanded after his death. Anti-colonial leaders across Africa and the Caribbean studied his speeches, drawing parallels between American racism and European imperialism. He became a symbol of global black pride, inspiring movements in Brazil, Britain, and South Africa. His portrait hung in student dorm rooms, community centers, and union halls. Music, poetry, literature, and film reinvented his image repeatedly, ensuring that future generations would never forget what he represented. Malcolm X left behind a legacy that redefined the civil rights era. He forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions. What is freedom? Who controls history? Why must liberation depend on approval from the powerful? His presence enriched the movement, exposing complexity and expanding possibility. Malcolm proved that resistance takes many shapes and that dignity can be weaponized against oppression. Even now, decades later, Malcolm's voice echoes in modern debates over policing, identity, nationalism, and inequality. His message remains alive. Liberation begins when people learn to love themselves enough to demand the world change with them. By the mid-1960s, the center of the civil rights movement began shifting from the rural South to America's northern and western cities. Although the South remained a legal and symbolic battleground, activists increasingly recognized that racism in places like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, and Los Angeles operated differently. In these regions, discrimination was not enforced by Jim Crow signs, but through real estate policies, police brutality, restricted job opportunities, and inadequate school funding. Northern racism, while less visible than Southern segregation, produced its own form of suffocation. African Americans migrating from the South had hoped for better lives, but many found themselves restricted to overcrowded ghettos where landlords charge high rents for unsafe buildings. Fire hazards, broken heating systems, rats, mold, and failing electricity were routine conditions. Meanwhile, white property owners refused to rent outside black neighborhoods, using racial covenants and intimidation to maintain separation. The federal government played a direct role in creating these divisions through redlining practices. Maps created by agencies like the Home Owners Loan Corporation marked black neighborhoods as hazardous investment areas. Banks then denied mortgage loans to African Americans, trapping families in rented housing and preventing wealth accumulation through homeownership. This system kept black families poor, while white families gained property wealth that could be passed to future generations. School funding followed property taxes, meaning that segregated neighborhoods produced segregated schools. Children in black schools often studied with outdated textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, and limited extracurricular opportunities. Many Northern whites denied racism existed at all because there were no official laws mandating separation. Yet the social result, black exclusion, remained nearly identical. Police tension made matters worse. In cities across the United States, police forces were overwhelmingly white, often treating black communities like occupied territories. Officers patrolled with suspicion rather than service, responding to neighborhoods not as citizens in need of protection, but as threats requiring control. Arrests rose dramatically for minor offenses. African Americans reported constant verbal harassment, arbitrary searches, and violent arrests. In some cities, police brutality became a daily experience. While the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act brought undeniable progress, they did not change the daily humiliation African Americans faced when walking to work, shopping in a grocery store, or trying to drive home without being stopped. These conditions created deep frustration among youth who believed the promises of the movement had not reached their communities. They supported nonviolence as moral principle, but they also questioned why oppression seemed untouched outside the South. The northern cities lacked the same publicity as Birmingham or Selma, and journalists rarely captured the painful inequality unfolding there. But anger continued to build beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to erupt. That moment arrived in August 1965, when Los Angeles became the stage for a dramatic uprising that exposed the nation's racial wounds once again. The Watts neighborhood, already suffering from unemployment, poverty, and police abuse, exploded into one of the most significant rebellions in American history. The Watts uprising began on August 11th, 1965, after the arrest of Marquette Fry, a young African-American man stopped for alleged drunk driving. A crowd gathered as police questioned Fry. Tensions escalated when officers attempted to tow his car, and a scuffle broke out between police and Fry's family members. Rumors spread rapidly through the neighborhood that police had beaten a pregnant woman, though later reports showed misunderstandings rather than confirmed facts. Still, the incident ignited decades of stored rage. Within hours, groups of angry residents filled the streets. Their anger was not about a single arrest. It was about relentless humiliation, joblessness, slum housing, and broken promises. As crowds multiplied, police attempted crowd control, but the situation escalated beyond their capacity. Rocks and bottles were thrown. Squad cars were damaged. That night, fires erupted as residents targeted symbols of neglect: liquor stores, pawn shops, and businesses believed to exploit the community. Police radio transmissions described the area as a war zone. Over the next several days, thousands of National Guard troops were deployed to restore order. Tanks rolled down residential streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Residents described the smell of smoke filling the air for days, while sirens echoed nonstop. The uprising lasted nearly a week, leaving 34 people dead, over 1,000 injured, and tens of millions of dollars in property damage. Newspapers across the country portrayed the rebellion as senseless criminality, ignoring the historical causes buried beneath the flames. Reporters asked why African Americans destroyed their own neighborhoods, missing the deeper truth that many businesses were owned by outsiders who took profit without reinvesting in the community. Poverty meant people lived daily without reliable food stores, medical clinics, or secure housing. Police departments conducted constant raids, making residents feel like prisoners in their own streets. The destruction symbolized desperation rather than nihilism. Many white Americans reacted with confusion or frustration. They had celebrated the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, believing the struggle was complete. They asked why African Americans were still angry. Some blamed activists like MalcolmX, insisting black nationalist rhetoric encouraged violence. Others claimed African Americans lacked discipline or gratitude. Few asked the deeper question: what conditions would push thousands of people to risk death rather than remain silent? Civil rights leaders, historians, and sociologists understood that uprisings like Watts were not spontaneous explosions. They were responses to systematic oppression that continued despite landmark legislation. Despite friction, King persisted, believing the struggle for economic justice must mirror the moral force that dismantled segregation in Montgomery and Birmingham. His speeches in Chicago warned that racial inequality was now more subtle but equally destructive. He declared that America had entered the next phase of the civil rights struggle, one that required dismantling de facto segregation rather than de jure segregation. However, the challenges ahead were enormous. The North lacked the clear legal targets that had defined earlier campaigns. King recognized that defeating discriminatory housing patterns, predatory banking, unjust school zoning, and political cronyism would require new tactics and deeper alliances. The Chicago campaign revealed the complexity of Northern racism and exposed the limits of public sympathy. Many white liberals supported integration in theory, but rejected it in practice when it threatened property values, school placements, or social comfort. King realized the battle for racial justice demanded changes to economic structures, not just hearts. This realization pushed him toward a broader vision of equality, one that would soon evolve into the Poor People's Campaign. The Chicago movement also highlighted the growing distance between King and younger activists who believed nonviolence had reached a breaking point. While King preached patience and moral persuasion, many young African Americans believed the time for persuasion had passed. They argued that the North demonstrated how racism adapted even when laws changed. For them, the hatred King witnessed in Chicago proved the nation had not transformed fundamentally. Leaders like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown criticized King for working with political establishments they viewed as corrupt. The rise of Black Power, thriving especially in northern cities, created ideological conflict. King, however, believed that abandoning nonviolence would surrender the movement's moral grounding. He argued that violent resistance would justify government crackdowns and destroy public support. King was also a theologian who believed violence contaminated the soul of both victim and perpetrator. He insisted the struggle must remain rooted in love, not hatred. Yet he also understood the anger fueling Black Power. King once remarked that if he had grown up in the urban North rather than the church-centered South, he might have shared the same frustration. His empathy, however, did not resolve deepening tensions. Mayor Richard J. Daley, Chicago's powerful political leader, understood how to maneuver public opinion and government policy. Daley refused to be portrayed as a Southern-style segregationist. He claimed the city was free of legal discrimination and insisted King's protests exaggerated racial problems. Daley used negotiations to stall progress and persuade the public that substantial reforms were underway. In truth, many promised housing agreements were unenforced. White neighborhoods continued blocking African American families from moving into their districts, and banks continued denying mortgage loans. King recognized that the Chicago movement had not produced the sweeping transformation he hoped for. The campaign revealed how resistant cities were to structural reform, especially when economic interests were threatened. But Chicago changed King in another profound way. It convinced him the civil rights struggle had moved beyond racial equality alone. Addressing racism without addressing economic exploitation would solve little. King saw capitalism itself as a system that thrived on inequality, dividing workers by color, controlling wages, and concentrating wealth among elites. These ideas pushed King further left politically, even aligning him at times with more radical activists he once opposed. While King faced northern challenges, the Vietnam War reshaped national priorities. Billions of dollars that might have funded urban development flowed into military efforts overseas. African American communities suffered budget cuts affecting schools, hospitals, housing, and employment programs. Many young Black men, disproportionately drafted, died in Vietnam while their families lived in poverty at home. King saw the war as a moral catastrophe, stealing resources from the poor and destroying hope. In 1967, he publicly denounced the war, arguing that the United States could not fight for democracy abroad while denying democracy to its own citizens. His stance angered the White House, cost him allies, and intensified FBI surveillance, but King could not remain silent. He insisted morality must guide politics. In Chicago, the combination of war, poverty, and ongoing racism built deep disillusionment. Residents told King that voting rights meant nothing without jobs, education, and safe housing. They asked why Black soldiers could fight and die overseas, but could not buy a home in white neighborhoods. They demanded more than inspiration. They demanded material change. King listened, realizing the next phase of his mission must unite all races living in poverty into a new political force, the Poor People's Campaign. King believed the fight for justice could not remain a racial battle alone. He argued that poverty affected white Black, Native American, Latino, and Asian American communities. Although racism made African Americans the most vulnerable, King insisted that economic injustice was a national tragedy. This belief shaped the Poor People's Campaign, a movement designed to bring thousands of poor Americans to Washington, D.C. to demand federal action on jobs, housing, healthcare, and fair wages. The campaign was ambitious, risky, and unlike anything the civil rights movement had attempted before. King hoped to create a multiracial coalition strong enough to challenge Congress and reshape the national economy. The Poor People's Campaign was rooted in an argument that echoed Malcolm X and Black Power activists. Racial equality without economic justice was incomplete. King worked to unite labor leaders, tenant unions, anti-war groups, welfare rights organizations, and religious allies. He intended to pressure elected officials through sustained, peaceful demonstrations. Unlike earlier protests focused on specific laws, this campaign targeted the nation's economic priorities. King wanted guaranteed income, full employment programs, and large-scale housing initiatives. He saw the federal government as responsible for providing social safety nets so families could escape generational poverty. Yet as King planned the campaign, opposition intensified. Critics accused him of stirring class warfare. White politicians feared the unity of poor people across racial lines, worrying such an alliance could change voting patterns. Many donors who once supported civil rights legislation withdrew funding, claiming King had abandoned his original mission. King responded that his mission had not changed, it had expanded. Freedom, he argued, must include the right to live with dignity, not just to sit at a lunch counter or enter a school. Media reaction signaled shifting public opinion. Editorial boards that once praised King now condemned him for opposing the Vietnam War and challenging capitalism. They argued his words threatened national stability. Meanwhile, the FBI escalated its harassment. Director J. Edgar Hoover viewed King as dangerous, labeling him a communist sympathizer and attempting to destroy his reputation. Wiretaps, informants, and psychological warfare were unleashed against him. King faced burnout, depression, and physical exhaustion, but he continued pushing forward because he believed unfinished work remained. In Chicago and beyond, King saw children starve, schools crumble, and people live in unheated homes. He believed America was experiencing violence not only through bombs and bullets, but through the slow brutality of poverty. His speeches criticized economic cycles that trap families regardless of their labor or intelligence. He insisted society must reorganize wealth, claiming that morality demanded economic redistribution. King was no longer viewed solely as a civil rights leader. He had become a revolutionary thinker challenging America's deepest structures. The Chicago campaign, though not victorious in the way Birmingham had been, exposed the truth. The next chapter of the civil rights movement would require confronting financial power, housing systems, and global imperial interests. In many ways, Chicago served as a bridge between King's earlier victories and his final battles. It showed him how deeply racism intertwined with capitalism, how necessary it was to ally with workers of all races, and how determined the nation was to protect wealth at the expense of justice. King remained undeterred. As he left Chicago and turned toward new horizons, he carried forward a belief that liberation required more than new laws. It required a new worldview. The civil rights movement was evolving into something broader, more challenging, and more urgent, a demand that America transform not only its laws but its soul. As the civil rights movement progressed into the late 1960s, the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War became a defining political earthquake that reshaped the movement, divided leaders, and deepened national polarization. In the early years of the war, mainstream civil rights organizations hesitated to critique foreign policy. Many feared speaking against the government could jeopardize support for domestic reform. But Martin Luther King Jr. increasingly viewed the war as morally contradictory to the goals of racial equality and social justice. He saw young black men drafted into combat at far higher rates than white men, forced in a battle on behalf of a nation that still denied them basic dignity at home. African Americans asked, with growing anger, why should we fight for freedom abroad when freedom is denied in our own cities? In poor neighborhoods from Harlem to Watts, mothers buried sons killed in Vietnam while their families lived in poverty. Many soldiers returned home traumatized, only to face racism, unemployment, and police violence. For King, silence was not an option. His Christian faith demanded truth-telling even when unpopular. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York, King delivered one of the most controversial speeches of his career beyond Vietnam. He declared the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, a statement that stunned political leaders. King argued that war funds rob poor communities of housing, education, and health support. He described how bombs dropped on Vietnamese villages also exploded socially in American ghettos, because every dollar spent on bloodshed was a dollar withheld from the poor. King insisted that moral consistency required opposing violence everywhere. To fight for civil rights while ignoring imperialism abroad was hypocrisy. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Newspapers that had once praised King now condemned him as reckless. Liberal allies distanced themselves, calling his speech a distraction that damaged the civil rights cause. President Lyndon B. Johnson, feeling personally betrayed, cut off direct communication with King. Federal agencies intensified surveillance, believing King's anti-war rhetoric aligned him with radical groups. Inside the movement, divisions grew. The NAACP leadership feared anti-war activism would jeopardize valuable relationships in Washington. Some civil rights leaders argued that King lacked expertise in foreign policy and should focus on racial issues. Civil rights organizers insisted that safety required access to opportunity, not just punishment. Despite polarization, real change occurred. Several cities experimented with unarmed crisis response teams for mental health emergencies. States passed laws banning chokeholds, requiring body cameras, and limiting qualified immunity. School districts removed police officers and hired counselors instead. These steps did not solve everything, but they showed that reform, once considered impossible, had become mainstream policy discussion. Technology again played a central role. Smartphones recorded police encounters, offering evidence that previously disappeared into official reports. Activists used GPS mapping to identify traffic stop patterns, showing black drivers were disproportionately targeted. Data scientists uncovered digital bias in facial recognition systems, proving algorithms misidentified black faces at alarming rates. These revelations reflected a new truth. Civil rights activism now required scientific literacy, technological expertise, and legal innovation. The decade also brought renewed calls for reparations. Historically, African Americans received no financial compensation for centuries of enslavement, labor exploitation, and forced cultural erasure. Economic studies revealed that the median white family still held many times the wealth of the median black family. Activists argued that without repairing this foundational inequality, America could never achieve racial justice. Reparations proposals range from direct payments to investment funds for housing, education, and business development in black communities. Debate intensified at universities, in Congress, and within the general public. Though politically divisive, reparations no longer existed only at the margins of conversation. It had become a core civil rights question.